when the Marquess claims a governess. Prologue. The carriage rattled down the road, rocking uneasily from side to side. Edward didn't mind the rain or the thunder because today it was just himself and Mother. When it was just him and Mother, he could speak freely for once. He could tell her about the books he was reading without being ridiculed by Robert, his twin, or talked down to by Father, who continued to be frustrated by his squeamishness towards hunting. Ever since the baby's arrival, it had been challenging to claim Mother's attention. Edward loved his new sister, but he also missed the ease of being able to converse with Mother whenever he saw fit. Yet despite Edward's joy at having her to himself, today Mother looked nervous. She kept fidgeting with the edge of her dress and asking Edward to repeat himself, even though they were discussing Robinson Crusoe, a mutual favourite. "What is it?" Edward finally asked. "Has something got you worried?" Mother offered him a thin smile. "Just the storm, my dear. These are hardly the best conditions for travel." Edward reached across the carriage and patted her hand. He was newly 15 and confident he could handle anything the world might throw at them, even the greatest forces of nature. "We'll be home soon, Mother. And there's no need for worry. Not as long as I'm—" That was the last thing Edward remembered. When he came to, his vision was foggy, his mind confused. It was still raining. But he was outside. In the dirt. "Mother," Edward tried to say. He began coughing instead. "Here! I'm here, my love!" Edward tried to turn towards the voice, but while he'd previously been numb to all but the rain, the motion sent a sharp pain through his leg below the knee. He cried out, "Stay still, Edward." Mother's voice was thin, strained. "The coachman has gone to fetch help. We must be still until he returns." "All right," Edward managed. It was hard to keep the tears out of his voice. It was also hard to know how much time had passed. If anything, it only rained harder. Edward's face was mushed into the slick muck of the road that must have, in part, caused their crash. He and Mother were both trapped under the overturned carriage. He also knew he was losing and gaining consciousness as the rain beat down on him. "Love, can you hear me?" Mother's voice again, dimmer. "Yes." "You need to stay awake." "I'm trying." "Promise me you'll stay awake, all right?" Then she said, "I'll sing to you." "Yes, Mother." This time Edward was sure he was crying. It was hard to tell for all the rain beating against his cheeks, but his throat was thick. Mother started in on a lullaby. Edward couldn't entirely make out the tune despite his best attempts at concentration. She wasn't singing really, just humming. Edward strained, desperate to focus, to hear her voice, to listen. But he was fading again, Itze, and there was nothing he could do. Edward woke with a jolt, heart pounding. It took him a moment to realize he was at home in his room. Yes, it was storming outside. The rain beat angrily against his window, but he was here, safe, alive, alone. His breathing quieted, and he took stock of himself. Though the loss of his left leg had been nearly 7 years ago to the day, the phantom pains were back. It wasn't unusual for the discomforting sensations to return in half-lucid moments between sleep and wakefulness, but combined with the recollections inspired by the storm. Edward felt tears threaten to fall. The night of the accident, after Edward lost consciousness one final time, the coachman at last returned with help. It had been a long walk to the nearest village, and when assistance arrived, Mother was already gone. Edward hadn't been able to attend the funeral, as he was still recovering following the loss of his leg. Father, however, didn't hesitate to loom over his son's sick bed and proclaim, "If you'd had the strength to free your own self from the wreckage, perhaps the outcome would have been different." The Edward from the previous week might have protested. especially at Robert's cold nod of assent from his place at father's right arm. The new Edward could only silently agree. And the Edward of today wasn't much better. He willed himself to go back to sleep, but with the storm still raging, such a feat proved impossible. In the end, he pulled himself into a sitting position and lit the candle left at his bedside. The serving staff always left him materials to relight it himself, as waking up in the night was a common occurrence. The light shone dimly on the table and reflected off his wooden leg, which was propped beside the table for easy access. The tiny glow was enough to soothe Edward's spirits, if only slightly. He cracked the spine of the new book he'd intended to leave for tomorrow and resolved to lose himself in the pages, where the storm could not follow. Chapter 1. The alley behind the inn smelled of rot and waste, but Margaret hardly noticed. She'd been swept away in her latest read, a thrilling tale of romance and adventure. With a building sense of dread, she flipped to the last page, read to the last line, and closed the back cover. It was over. Margaret took a deep breath and tried to get her bearings as reality took over once more. It was always so strange, coming out of the dream of a good story. Just moments ago, in the luxurious sprawl of her imagination, she'd been storming through the hills on horseback, caught up in the arms of a dashing gentleman. Now. The door to the alley swung open. Nick, the other cook, threw out a bucket of soiled water. Margaret had to leap out of the way to avoid soaking the bottom of her dress. "You might watch yourself," Margaret said, with the book hanging limply at her side. "You might do your job," Nick replied. His eyes were teasing, though. "If I get any more extra practice with these recipes, I'll surpass your mastery. Best be on guard, Miss Andrews." Margaret felt her face flush. She looked away. Mastery, hardly. "I mean it. That's what all the patrons are saying. Rupert as well." Margaret flushed deeper still. Rupert, an old friend of Margaret's late father, had been the one to offer her the job as a cook in the first place. They were relatively close, but he rarely tossed around compliments on a whim. "Thank you," Margaret said at last, ignoring the unexpected prick of tears. She'd been shown such generosity by Rupert and his wife, Johanna. It was hard not to show how deeply their assistance still affected her. Nick pressed his lips together and nodded, perhaps a little uncomfortable, and returned to the kitchen. Once he was gone, Margaret allowed herself to slump forward and feel what her heart was demanding. She was fortunate to be here. She knew that. But it was hardly so simple. This wasn't how she'd imagined her life unfolding, for one. And sometimes she missed father with such an intensity, it felt as if her ribs were cracking in her chest, jagged shards digging into her soft insides. He'd been a gambler and a drunkard. Many times Margaret had half carried him to his chamber, helped him to bed. But he'd been hers. Now she had no one. "That's not true," Margaret muttered fiercely, before the tears could really take hold. "You have Rupert and Johanna. They've done more than right by you. You'd best do right by them." With that, Margaret folded her book under her arm and followed after Nick. Wash, chop, stir. Some seasoning here. A splash of broth there. Plating dishes to appeal to the eye. Imagining with all the might of her senses the pleasure her efforts would bring the inn's patrons. The kitchen inspired a familiar dance. Margaret wasn't completely unhappy at the Royal Lion after all. The patrons were kindly, and she was on friendly terms with many of the regulars, who often made attempts to compliment her personally. It had gotten so that she knew many of their orders by heart, and it brought her a small spark of joy each time a guest returned and requested the same dish again. Laughs were shared here, smiles, warmth. But by the end of each day there was no denying Margaret was tired, her feet aching, the small muscles supporting her shoulders overly tense from stirring and lifting. "Miss Andrews," Rupert said, and Margaret looked up from the counter she'd been cleaning. "It's time I locked up." Margaret's eyes ticked to the window that looked out onto the street. When had it gotten dark? My apologies, sir. She stepped back from the counter and ducked her head. Time must have gotten away from me. There was a smile in Rupert's voice when he answered. It's been about a month now, hasn't it? How would you say you're faring? Well, almost. Thank you again for the opportunity. Miss Andrews. Rupert inclined his head as if to say, Are you quite sure, child? Margaret smiled sadly. I have been well as can be expected. It's painful still sometimes. I would imagine so. I wasn't myself for months after the passing of my father. Years, when my mother's time came. Margaret nodded slightly but held her tongue. Her own mother had died in childbirth. As a girl, she'd thought she'd held grief for her mother's premature passing. But now she knew that feeling was nothing more than nostalgia for what she'd never known. Grief meant longing for what you'd once had. In any case, said Rupert, when it became clear Margaret didn't intend to respond, I hope you know how grateful we are to have you here. You've been doing a phenomenal job in the kitchen. I haven't been counting exactly, but even just this last week our patronage seems to have increased. More folks are enjoying themselves enough to return. I would imagine if that is the case, it's because of your savvy business sense. Ah, perhaps, Rupert smiled and waved a finger at Margaret. I'm not so lacking in pride that I won't take a kind word from a charming woman, but in truth I'm certain it's a combination of both. The warmth in Rupert's eyes made something heal in Margaret just a little. Thank you. Both of you, she said, meaning Johanna as well. Rupert nodded in acknowledgement. I'll pass your kind thanks along. Then, as he was turning to leave, he said, I'll leave your payment on the main table in the dining room. Enough for tonight. Get some rest, Miss Andrews. Margaret was tempted to do precisely as Rupert suggested and leave the rest of resetting the kitchen for the morning. But a job wasn't done until it was done. She finished wiping the counter, then moved on to tidying the dining room itself. The moon was high outside the window by the time she pocketed her pay and returned to the quarters Rupert had leased her for a fraction of the typical price. She prepared a humble dinner for herself and read by candlelight far longer than was responsible. When she finally collapsed into bed, her eyes and body were heavy, but her soul felt lightened. With cool night air breezing in, Margaret slipped away into a land of fantasy, not so far removed from the fictional world she'd just left behind. Chapter 2. After breakfast the following morning, Edward retired to his study to continue the book he'd begun the night before. He hadn't expected to be so taken by the first chapter in that impossible-to-put-down sort of way. A knock came on the study door. "Come in," Edward called. Ruby, the maid, poked her head in. "My lord, the doctor is here." Edward sighed and closed the book. Perhaps his deep dive into the forays of this latest fiction had less to do with the quality of the book itself. Though it was a stirring narrative, there was no denying that. And more to do with what he wanted to avoid in reality. "Very well. I'll be there momentarily. Thank you, Ruby." Ruby began to leave, then hesitated. "Should I fetch Miss Rebecca as well?" Edward considered this. His sister was surprisingly mature for a girl of only 8, and when it was just the two of them, she could contribute to discussions far beyond her years. Even so. Best not, Edward decided. I do not want her worrying any more than necessary. Ruby nodded and left. Edward set the book aside and followed suit. As he moved down the long, ornate hallways of the home reserved for the Duke of Somerset, his father, Thomas Lockwood, Edward prepared himself for what would surely be a heated meeting. "Finally, decided to grace us with your presence, have you?" Robert sniped from his place at father's bedside. "At least I'm dressed and presentable," Edward deadpanned back. "What hour did you return to us last night? Or was it this morning?" Do keep your envy to yourself, dear brother. The physician they had called didn't acknowledge Edward's entrance or comment, instead keeping his attention on examining the Duke, who, 3 days past, had fallen inexplicably ill with a respiratory ailment. Well, perhaps not inexplicably. The Duke had neglected his health a great deal these past few years. It wasn't terribly surprising that eventually all the drinking and smoking caught up with him. Robert, judging from his scoundrel-like, rankled appearance, was not horribly far behind. Sometimes even Edward had a difficult time believing they were twins. "Well," said the physician at long last, sitting back and adjusting his spectacles. "As it stands, His Grace's lungs are partially functional, and barely that." He made eye contact with Robert, then Edward, then Robert again, and said with intensity, "If he is to have any hope of recovery, he must remain in bed, avoid physical activity, and above all else, avoid smoking." Edward looked back at his sleeping father in surprise. This made it sound as if father were dying, not merely a bit under the weather. But when Edward looked closer, he noticed with greater clarity the paper-thin look of father's sallow skin and the laboured wheeze of his breath. "Good Lord," Robert said, looking a little shaken himself. Edward answered the physician. "I will make sure he goes by your advice. Thank you for venturing all this way so early." "It is my honour, my lord," said the physician with a short bow. Ruby, who had been lingering outside the door, stepped inside His Grace's chambers. "May I escort you out, Mr. Acker?" The physician left with Ruby. Edward and Robert were alone with their ill father. A swell of dread and damned longing overtook Edward, and he found himself kneeling suddenly by his father's bedside. The Duke opened his eyes just slightly and mumbled something before closing them again. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, and it was unlikely he was lucid, but Edward couldn't help himself. "Are you all right, father?" Robert snorted from behind him. "Are you all right, father?" he mimicked. "Don't bother acting afraid now or trying to butter him up. Bad blood has been running between the two of you for far too long." Edward kept himself very still, bad blood boiling indeed. In moments like these, he was almost grateful for his disability. If he'd had both of his legs and half a chance at winning the fight, there would be little stopping him from attacking his brother outright. "You speak for yourself," Edward said, miraculously managing to keep his voice level. "I, despite what you think, care for the man." The Duke blinked again, slowly, but if he had anything to add to the discussion, it was lost to weakness and fever. Robert huffed a derisive laugh. Edward finally risked looking up to see his brother's face, twisted in disdain. They had been born identical, but by now that past reality mattered little. Robert had both his legs, so anyone who cared to look would easily be able to tell them apart. And more than anything else, Robert's expressions cycled between dark glee and rage. Edward didn't know how his own expressions made him come across, but he was almost positive it wasn't that. What had happened to Robert to make him like this? "What are you staring at?" Robert demanded, when he noticed Edward's scrutiny. He turned his eyes heavenward, making a show of it. "You really couldn't be any more pathetic, could you?" Edward pressed his lips together, determined not to take the bait. Robert eventually shook his head and left the room, hopefully to get presentable to face the day and any guests who might come calling. Robert, after all, was to be father's heir. The forward-facing roles of the household consistently fell to the able-bodied twin without debate. With Robert gone, the room went quiet. The only sound was the knocking of the wind against the window and father's fitful sleep. Edward couldn't stand to be here another moment. It took some effort to stand up again. He was glad Robert had gone before he'd made the attempt, and left his father's bedchambers. Initially he meant to return to the study and continue reading, but when he reached the threshold he found it wasn't just his father's chambers he wished to escape, but the house in its entirety. "I'll return shortly," Edward told Ruby minutes later, on his way out the front door. Shall I make sure to have lunch at the ready? No, thank you. I'll eat while I'm away. Outside the grandiose frame of the Lockwood family home, London was alight with people going about their days, whether those activities involved work or frolic or some combination. The sky was an unusually bright blue for early spring, with hardly a cloud to mar the robin's egg expanse of sunny pastel colour. The scent of fresh flowers covered the less savoury smells of the city, and the air felt fresh on Edward's skin. It was the morning after a storm. Edward made a right at the gate and adopted the slow, measured pace he always took when he left the house. At home, while he hated to be caught doing it by father or Robert and reprimanded, it was permissible to walk a little less straight, a little more casually. Outside, Edward didn't dare. No, out here he walked straight and tall. An attempt at regality, or at least wholeness and propriety. He tried to stay focused on his posture to make sure he was smiling and nodding in greeting at anyone he passed. This way their attention would be drawn to his face, and not the somewhat noisy prosthetic that began at his knee and kept him upright. It was no use. Edward couldn't get his mind off of father. And not just father, but Rebecca as well. He was close with Rebecca in a way father and Robert simply were not. Robert thought the little girl was dim, improper, obnoxious. Edward knew Rebecca was in truth merely a touch shy. Regardless if father failed to recover from his illness and Robert inherited the estate. Well, who was to say Robert wouldn't turn both him and Rebecca out on the street? No, Edward muttered to himself. He's your brother. As if that had ever made any difference when it came to Robert. Eventually Edward found himself in front of the Royal Lion Oyster Bar, his intended destination. He usually went further up the road to a different oyster bar, but he never travelled by carriage anymore if he could help it, and he was tired from staying up most of the night reading. Besides that, the weariness of this new drama with his brother was already leaching its way into his bones. He would make do with eating here, even if it was Robert's usual hangout. It was nearly noon, and the Royal Lion was relatively full. It was a nice establishment, clean, with a fair amount of embellishment and a red and gold colour scheme. Edward spotted a secluded corner table and hastened to claim it as quickly as his prosthetic would allow. This way he could enjoy the food without having to worry about people staring at his leg. The wood of his prosthetic leg was always visible through the hem of his breeches, and the noise it gave under each step made Edward cringe inwardly. The sort of people frequenting an establishment such as this was familiar, to say the least. High-born, gossipy, entitled. Edward was sure many of them knew his family, though not many knew him personally. Edward preferred to keep to himself. That at least had been true of him even before the accident. Edward turned his eyes off the other patrons and studied the menu. Once he'd made up his mind, he glanced up, hoping to catch the eye of a server to place an order. And there she was. A young woman, blonde, slim and green-eyed. She was aesthetically stunning, beautiful in a way he'd never seen before. But it wasn't just her appearance. No, it was something in the way she moved. A sort of dignified grace that suited her so well Edward couldn't imagine it on anyone else. Then there was her face, too. She was talking with a family at a table several spaces away from Edward's, laughing and joking, like joy and a zest for conversation were her defaults. But when the young woman left the table, her face darkened, just a little. It was a private look, the sort of look she probably didn't imagine anyone else taking notice of. There was an unexpected somberness there, a twist of sadness and stress. Who is this young woman? Edward thought. And what circumstances is she living in to prompt such simultaneous joy and grief? Edward hadn't voiced these questions out loud, but the girl must have felt his eyes on her because she turned from her original path back towards the kitchen and scanned until she caught his gaze. Edward felt his face grow warm. He offered a small, hopefully not too embarrassed smile and a short nod. The young woman's face tightened. The tightness turned to a glare. Edward frowned, confused. The young woman shook her head, dismissing him, and returned to the kitchen. Edward could do nothing but sit there. He felt like he'd been bucked from a horse. An unusual feeling, drawn up from an old memory, as of course he hadn't mounted a horse since he was a boy of 15. How had a stranger had such an effect on him? Had he done something to merit her glare? "Ah, Robert," came a voice to Edward's left. He was accustomed to being recognised as his brother on the odd occasions he did venture into the world willingly, so he turned in answer to the name. It was Lord William Beauchamp, Robert's friend from childhood. There'd been a time when they were very small that the three of them had played together. But both Robert and William had taken to hunting and other athletics with an interest Edward never understood. By the time they had properly begun their studies, William might as well have been Robert's twin in Edward's place. "Lord Beauchamp," Edward greeted him with stiff politeness. "I suppose I ought to have expected running into you here." William's smile froze. The two women who accompanied him exchanged a glance. "Edward," he said at last, "my apologies." "It's no matter. The booth was obstructing your view." "Yes, well." William ticked his eyes to one of the women at his side. Usually William had no qualms about digging in at Edward in the same way Robert did. Whether he was holding back now because he was in the company of women or because Robert wasn't here to offer approval couldn't be known. "I suppose I'll see you some other time, then." "I suppose so." William offered a curt, slightly awkward nod, then left with his two companions. Edward watched him go. What an unusual and mysterious man. Chapter 3. Margaret let out a breath when she returned to the kitchen. 1 minute she'd been having a fine day, typical if busy. The next he was here again, that scoundrel Marquess who always gave her such a hard time. "He's back?" Nick asked from his place at the counter. He'd been chopping onions to add to the beef stew. Margaret could only nod mutely. Nick brought his knife down a little harder than usual. It isn't fair that you have to be the one dealing with him so often. "What's all this now?" Rupert asked, squeezing through the kitchen door behind Margaret. "Miss Andrews, I noticed you on your way back into the kitchen just now, and it seemed as if something had given you a fright. Are you quite all right?" "I'm fine," Margaret managed, and straightened herself up. She didn't like having all this attention on her. Besides, the man had only stared at her from across the room today. Usually when she waited on the Marquess and his friends, he was much bolder, leering at her, or even grabbing her wrist when she set down a plate. Once, when she'd been on her way home for the evening, he and his friends had followed her some distance, laughing and jeering. They'd herded her into a darkened street and could have forced her into something awful, had it not been for the evening patrol making their rounds. Rupert frowned, unconvinced. "Why don't you take a break? Eat something." "Oh no," said Margaret, hustling around him to join Nick at the counter. There were other ingredients that needed to be chopped, surely something she could fill her hands with. "We're too busy for that just now. I'll eat later." Nick snatched the extra knife off the counter before Margaret could claim it. "I think Rupert and I both insist. I can cover here. Right, Rupert?" "Indeed. Nick, be so kind as to pour Miss Andrews a bowl of that stew, would you?" Before Margaret could protest further, Nick was passing a warm, sloshing bowl of savoury beef stew into her hands. "Go eat," both men said at once. Margaret felt a little knot of tension between her shoulders release itself. Often she didn't know when she was getting overwhelmed by stress until it was already too late. An increasingly familiar wave of gratitude came over her. How fortunate she was to have such good people looking out on her behalf. "I suppose a few minutes wouldn't hurt," Margaret allowed. Both Rupert and Nick smiled, pleased. Rupert retreated to the main dining hall to continue hosting the guests, while Nick resumed chopping more vegetables to add to the pot. His manner was a little calmer now, a little more like he was truly just cooking a meal, and less like he was practicing to dismember someone. Margaret took her stew to the staff room. She sat at the weathered table wedged between the supply shelves and took tiny sips of the scalding broth, while paging back to where she'd left off in her latest read. Usually Margaret didn't read in the staff room, preferring the alley outside the inn, out of fear that Rupert might come inside and decide she'd secretly been a slacker all this time. It was a poor way to demonstrate her thanks for how good he'd been to her. Then again, Margaret did get overwhelmed sometimes by the bustle of the inn and the occasional cruel customer. The best way to counter that was a moment or two to herself, or better yet, a moment with the latest cast of characters who had nestled their way up close to her heart. Rupert never came out into the alleyway. What he didn't know wouldn't hurt him. But for now, as Margaret ate her stew and ventured deeper into the narrative of her novel, she was content to just sit for a moment and take a much-needed break. What was wrong with that Marquess, anyway? One might think he was just too attached to the drink. Margaret, however, was more than accustomed to dealing with drunkards. She couldn't count the number of times she'd had to venture out at night to escort her drunken father out of whatever establishment he'd chosen for his latest descent into debauchery. This wasn't that. The Marquess had an intentional air of maliciousness about him. Margaret sighed and set her book aside. Her thoughts lingered on those late nights with father. In those instances, even drunk, he'd been a solid presence there with her in the face of men with potentially ill intentions, a protector, or at least someone whose presence said to the world, "This one is spoken for." She'd never been attacked outright before being orphaned. "Yes, now I have Rupert and Nick," Margaret thought, "but I'm an employee here, not a daughter or a wife. I cannot rely on them forever, can I?" Chapter 4. For once, Edward found it difficult to focus on his reading. He couldn't get the young woman from the oyster bar out of his head. The way she had carried herself, so confident and sure. And then the fiery way she had looked at him.
Before we continue into the story, do us a favor. Like this video and hit the subscribe button because it helps very much with YouTube's algorithm. If you want the audiobooks ads free, visit our website and select our bundles to save more. Thank you again. Now back to our story.
Well, no wonder he couldn't shake the memory of her. She was, quite possibly, the most beautiful woman Edward had ever seen. He couldn't say precisely why exactly, just that there was something special, different about her. Many women had approached him over the years, women of all statuses, even with his disability. He supposed, in a technical sense, he was still a promising match, going by his family's status alone. But none of the other women had caught his attention quite like this. Someone knocked lightly on the study door. Edward marked his page and looked up, prepared to tell whoever it was to come in, but Rebecca was already shoving the door open. Her face was red, her eyes and nose wet. Edward!" Edward got to his feet as quickly as he could with the prosthetic. "Rebecca, what's wrong?" He held open his arms to her, and she ran to him, hugging him tightly around the waist and crying into his shirt. For a girl of 8, her grip was surprisingly strong. "Robert." "What has he done, dear girl?" She sniffled and said something into Edward's stomach. Edward petted her hair. "Rebecca, please speak clearly. I want to help." She pulled back and wiped at her eyes. She took a hiccuping breath and then another. "Robert says he's getting rid of Dorothy. He said she was getting too old and called her useless." Dorothy was Rebecca's governess. Edward was upset, but in all honesty, hardly shocked. Of course Robert would pull something like this. Usually, though, it was to Edward's detriment, not Rebecca's. "That's outrageous," Edward said through gritted teeth. "She's the kindest woman of all." He looked down at his sister. "You stay here. I will have a word with him immediately." Edward patted Rebecca's head one last time before storming out into the hall. He heard voices from around the corner that led into the foyer and followed them to find Robert and William conversing, presumably on their way out for the evening. "Good evening, William," Edward said without even looking him in the eye. Right now, all of his attention was on Robert. "And you, brother? Have you no decency? Do you care about our sister's education? Even slightly?" Robert eyed Edward up and down. Only then did Edward realize he'd backed his brother against the wall. Robert offered a derisive smile. This regards the governess, I take it. Do not play me, Robert, or so help me God. What will you do? Robert's voice was quiet, cold. Or rather, what can you do, my poor crippled brother? Behind Edward, William laughed. Edward looked back over his shoulder and glared. It was enough to get William to quiet, but there was still that mirthful look in his eyes. Monsters, the both of them. Father will certainly object to this, Edward threatened, voice low. William laughed again, this time louder, imbued with even more arrogance. Robert himself just scoffed. Father is already informed. He agrees we must get rid of anyone who isn't of use, and it isn't as if that little imp of a sister is learning anyway. Robert said that last bit as if he expected Edward to agree. Edward knit his brow, puzzled, but then he heard a quiet gasp behind him, followed by light, quickly retreating feet. Rebecca must have been listening in. Edward gave Robert a single shove before turning to go after Rebecca, or perhaps more pressingly, confirm Father's intentions for himself. You are heartless, he hissed. Yes, well, Robert said, chuckling as Edward retreated. Do take care to watch your step, brother. You wouldn't want to lose another leg while running to Father. Father, Dorothy is like a mother to Rebecca. You couldn't possibly fire her after all these years of service, said Edward, at his father's bedside once more. Father was better today than he had been the day before. He was sitting up and could speak a little, though his energy came and went at irregular intervals. With wheezes between words, he answered his son. It is useless to waste any further effort in this manner. I don't have the energy for re-examining decisions that have already been made. There's nothing at all Dorothy can do to sway you. Besides turning back the clock, no, she's too old, losing her touch. Rebecca needs a better governess, one with experience and the enthusiasm of youth. Carefully, Edward asked, is that what a father wants for his daughter? Or something that would serve Robert's interest? Father balked. How dare you speak of your brother in such a manner? Robert isn't the issue here, Father. It is of Rebecca's interest I'm concerned. But Father had said his last bit with such intensity it had sent him into a coughing fit. Edward cut himself off to allow Father to regain his composure. Tentatively he reached a hand out, as if to pat Father on the back, to help. Father waved him off. My decision is final, he wheezed. Leave me. Father, I said leave. Edward jerked back. Stiffly, barely containing his rage, he stood. Very well. I wish you a swift recovery. Father didn't respond. He'd returned to coughing full out. But if he didn't want Edward's help, well, Edward had done enough begging. He left the bedchamber and returned to his study. He paced back and forth, loath to sit still, despite the discomfort caused by the prosthetic. Drat! Edward yelled, when he could take it no more. He grabbed a thick book off the side table and hurled it across the room. It knocked into a globe and then thudded onto the floor, open-faced, its pages pulled and twisted at odd angles. Edward felt immediate regret. The one solace he had was his library. He went to the book and picked it up. After smoothing the wrinkled pages, he held it to his chest and bowed his head. He needed to calm down and think of something positive. Re-evaluate from there. He would not let Robert's attempt to render him feeling useless, helpless, succeed. He thought of the girl from the oyster bar. Before Edward had consciously made up his mind to do what he was about to, he found himself leaving the study, walking down the hall, and then leaving the house altogether. He turned right at the gate, just as he had the day before. The Royal Lion was but a short walk away. Chapter 5. The day was quieter than usual. It wasn't that Margaret didn't want the Royal Lion's business to thrive, but it was nice every now and then to have the chance to play catch-up. Orders were few and manageable, and she was able to send out every patron's food in a timely manner. She was busy preparing the pickled salmon for one of their regulars when Rupert entered the kitchen. "Miss Andrews, when you have a minute, there is a customer who wishes to speak with you." "Of course," Margaret said, though her pulse picked up at the pronouncement. Had she done something wrong? "I'll be there momentarily." Margaret got to a stopping point with the preparation of her current dish. She wiped off her hands, then left the kitchen to meet up with Rupert and whoever this customer was. She stopped in her tracks. It was him. The vile, rude, ill-mannered Marquess who had repeatedly harassed her with his words and actions. Only now did Margaret realise she had never directly pointed out the man who caused her such discomfort to Rupert. He thought this was just another regular patron, or more than that, a regular patron with money. "Greetings," the man began, while Margaret stood frozen. "I wanted to sincerely congratulate you for your superb skills preparing this meal." Margaret's tongue felt thick in her mouth. How to respond? Just then, a new, large group entered the inn, laughing boisterously. Rupert smiled and nodded at both Margaret and the man. "Excuse me, my lord, I must see to an urgency." Rupert left to greet these new patrons. Margaret was alone with the man. Silence stretched between them. "How are you?" the Marquess asked, in a tentative, slightly awkward way Margaret hadn't expected. Was he acting this way out of some sort of puppy-dog attempt at remorse? If so, Margaret didn't want to hear it. "Thank you for your compliments," she finally said flatly, and turned to leave. A touch grazed the back of her hand. Instinctively, Margaret turned and slapped him. The silence returned, now thick with Margaret's shock at herself and embarrassment. The whole room had gone quiet, even the boisterous group Rupert had just seated. Margaret cast her eyes around for her employer, expecting her mortification to expound tenfold. Thankfully, he must have returned to the kitchen or the staff room. The Marquess touched his reddened cheek, stunned. "How have I offended you, miss?" How had he? The audacity! Margaret felt tears threaten. She shouldn't confront him here, not in the dining hall, not in front of all these people. But she couldn't hold back any longer. Lowly, she hissed, "Today or all the other occasions you and your friend Lord Beauchamp have tried to have your way with me." The Marquess looked even more confused for a moment, but then his eyes darkened. "You must have mistaken me for my brother. This is only my second time here." Oh, what a line! Margaret shook her head angrily, indicating she was done with this conversation, and turned to leave. The Marquess risked touching her hand once more. "Please, I'm telling you the truth," he said, even as Margaret jerked back a second time. "I am Edward Lockwood, the crippled twin. It is my brother Robert who has been causing you this grief." The Marquess gestured to his leg as he hiked up the leg of his trousers. Margaret would not have noticed had she not been looking for it, but it was true. A prosthetic marked the place where the lower half of his left leg would have been. "Oh," Margaret's snappy response dried up in her mouth. "I'm so sorry," she said, feeling rather light-headed. How awful to have forced a man to bring attention to his disability as proof of honesty. The Marquess, Lord Edward, cleared his throat. "Please don't worry yourself. I know better than most how vile my brother can be, and I wouldn't disagree had you reacted worse by my misunderstood advancement. I should apologise." At some point, the patrons of the Royal Lion had gone back to their earlier conversations, likely having become uncomfortable themselves with the skirmish unfolding near the kitchens. Margaret studied this other, more gentlemanly Marquess, and re-evaluated their conversation, now that she knew what she did. He'd complimented her cooking. "My name is Margaret Andrews," she said warmly. Lord Edward beamed. "Edward Lockwood. It is a genuine pleasure, Miss Andrews." Margaret found herself surprised by this reaction, but taken nonetheless. His brother, Robert, always glowered, or if he did smile, there was a vicious sort of glee to it. Edward's smile was bright, lovely, if perhaps a little shy. Oh, but what an airy, fruitless notion. Why on earth would a Marquess feel shy around the likes of her? A third silence, this one awkward in the ways the others were not. Margaret wanted to stay and continue speaking with Edward, but tables were filling up. She needed to get back to the kitchen. Edward must have caught on to her internal debate, because after a moment of looking unsure himself, he took a step forward and in a rush said, "Do you serve desserts here as well?" He lifted an eyebrow, tentatively playful. Margaret saw the excuse for what it was and had to laugh. "Why, yes, Lord Edward, we most certainly do." The evening picked up speed after that. Edward returned to one of the few remaining empty tables, a secluded booth towards the back of the room, while Margaret ventured back to the kitchen. Nick was cooking up a storm, covering for Margaret, as several new orders had piled up while she'd been speaking with Edward. "I'll handle the seafood dishes, if you'll keep on with that fresh batch of stew," Margaret offered, jumping back into the action at the counter. Nick reached an arm past her to grab some spices off the rack. "You sure you're up for it? I saw you talking to that man. You seemed to hold your own, but I wanted to make certain." It wasn't the same man. "What do you mean?" "Apparently," said Margaret, organising supplies for the dishes in her queue, "the monstrous Marquess has a twin brother. The one who has been giving me trouble is Robert. This one, Edward, just went out of his way to compliment my cooking." Nick stopped chopping and gave Margaret an incredulous look. "I know," said Margaret, hoping the collar of her dress covered the blush creeping up her neck. She pushed the seafood supplies to the back of her workspace. First, she intended to prepare the Royal Lion's finest dessert. Edward took his time eating after Margaret brought the food out. She thought it only fitting to deliver the dish personally, as acknowledgement of his earlier kindness. And if she lingered at his table a little longer than necessary, well, who could blame her for enjoying the presence of such a delightful gentleman? Then later, just as she was reaching down to take back the empty dessert plate, Margaret's eyes caught sight of something wondrous. "Is that the new Austen?" Margaret asked, nodding to the book at Edward's side. Why had she even bothered asking? Of course it was. She had an identical copy stored away right now with her belongings in the staff room. Edward's eyes brightened further. "You've read it?" "I'm about halfway through right now." "Then that's even farther than me. You mustn't tell me what happens." "And ruin all the grand suspense? Never!" They both laughed. It wasn't that the conversation was particularly funny, but neither Rupert nor Nick cared much for reading. Margaret hadn't had someone to share her love of books with since father passed away. The realization came with a dull ache in her chest. Even so, her newfound sense of joy didn't dissipate. If anything, at the sight of the laughter at the edge of Edward's eyes, it grew. "I'm so sorry for departing so abruptly earlier," Rupert said, coming up to the table. "We had a delivery arrive earlier than expected that ended up sweeping my attention." "That's perfectly all right," said Edward, as he counted out his payment. He set the money on the table and looked at Margaret. "I was glad for the opportunity to continue speaking with Miss Andrews." "And I as well," Margaret answered. "I do hope we will meet again. It seems there is plenty between us that merits further discussion." Rupert looked between them. "Well," he said after a moment, "thank you, my lord, for your patronage. Can I assist you on your way out?" "No, thank you," said Edward, climbing out of the booth with relative ease. Margaret imagined he must have already had years of practice navigating life with the prosthetic. As she stepped to the side to allow him to exit, she subtly scanned Edward up and down, looking for other differences between him and his vile brother. Edward was certainly the gentleman of the two, there was no denying that. But he was also, perhaps, slightly taller, his jawline sharper, his eyes kinder. "Farewell, Miss Andrews," Edward said with a short incline of his head. "And farewell to you, Lord Edward." Once Edward was gone, Margaret returned to the kitchen once more. Her thoughts, however, remained fixated on their encounter. One thing was absolutely certain. Edward's legs spoiled nothing. He was as equally handsome and charming as any man with 2 legs. No, he was more so. Chapter 6. Edward's heart felt light after leaving the Royal Lion, but it wasn't long before his thoughts darkened again. His brother truly was a despicable man, wasn't he? To think, not only had Robert's actions almost spoiled Edward's first true conversation with Margaret, but from what she'd said, he'd horrible, disgraceful. Never had Edward felt so ashamed to share both name and appearance with his brother. He will not threaten her again, Edward said to himself low under his breath. There was no one around presently to hear. Still, it felt binding in a way, making this sort of commitment out loud. Never, not if I can help it. Margaret, opposite to Robert, couldn't be more of a delight. An educated woman who carried herself with class, despite her lack of societal status. She read books, loved to cook, and cooked quite splendidly at that. Edward wanted to see her again. Not only that, he wanted to get to know more about her. What was she passionate about? Who were the loved ones in her life? What did she hope for her future? Perhaps, in turn, she would want to know him as well. Edward stopped walking. He was nearly home, but he was tired and admittedly emotionally overwhelmed. For so long, when it came to women, or anyone really, Edward had laboured under the assumption that he would be an inconvenience to them at best, or that they would agree to be with him only for his money and title. But with Margaret, their conversation had come so easily. They shared so many of the same interests. Perhaps there was a chance, even just a small one, that she could feel affection for him as he did for her. If that miracle were to come to pass, Robert could inherit all their father's assets, all the titles and property and responsibility. Edward wouldn't care. "Why do you have such a foolish grin on your face?" Robert asked the next morning at breakfast. It was just him, Edward and Rebecca at the table as father was still confined to his bedchamber. "You look positively oafish." Rebecca's eyes ticked between her brothers before her gaze landed and stayed on her barely picked-at plate of food. A part of Edward bristled on her behalf. Leave it to Robert to make what was meant to be a pleasant family mealtime a sour start to the day. Rebecca should feel free to converse at the table, to share with them any new interests that had caught her attention, or what she was learning from her tutelage. But Edward was determined not to let Robert get to him today. Maybe if he stood up to his brother, even in small ways, it would help Rebecca feel more confident against him as well. "If I look oafish, you do as well," Edward said, after swallowing a bite of biscuit and jam. "At least I'm a happy oaf." Rebecca giggled. Robert shot her a glare. She wilted again. Edward added, "You're a scowly oaf." This time Rebecca snorted and covered her mouth. Whether it was to hide her returned gaiety or avoid spewing food, Edward wasn't sure, but he felt positively buoyant. Rebecca had been so low since father's verdict about Dorothy. It was good to see her smiling once more. Robert, however, wasn't smiling in the slightest. He got to his feet and threw his napkin on the table. "This right here is why we need a new governess." He narrowed his eyes at Rebecca. "It's high time the brat learned her manners." With that, Robert stormed away. A member of the kitchen staff nearly dropped the plate she was carrying when he passed, but somehow maintained her balance. Edward looked to Rebecca, worried Robert's biting comment would have her shrinking into herself again. It hadn't. Rebecca looked up at Edward, a smile in her eyes, and dabbed at the crumbs on her glee-pursed lips. Edward had intended to wait at least one full day before returning to the Royal Lion, but breakfast left him in such a grand mood, he found himself unable to focus on anything besides the thought of returning to once again converse with the lovely Margaret. He managed to hold off until dinner time. So much for waiting an entire day. Holding off even this long felt like a minor miracle. "Well," Edward said to himself, closing his book and standing up, "it was a valiant effort." The walk to the Royal Lion felt shorter each time. perhaps because anticipation made Edward's sense of time operate at a quicker pace. When he arrived, it was more crowded than it had been the day before, but Edward still managed to procure the last open table. Of course, this wasn't his preferred secluded spot in the back of the dining hall, which meant people were more apt to stare at him as he walked over and took his place. Even with the noise of the restaurant, the noise from the mechanics in his leg did turn some heads as he walked by. But it had been 7 years, and he was used to it. Today, not even the public's pitying scrutiny could dispel his fine mood. The savoury scent of the fine dishes surrounding him reminded Edward that he was hungry for actual food as well as Margaret's company. He scanned the menu, looking to try something new. When he looked up again, there she was. She'd just exited the kitchen but stopped outright when they made eye contact. Her smile widened. Her eyes lit up. Edward felt like he was falling. His stomach was in his throat with a sudden influx of nerves and affection. He hastened to smile back, hoping he didn't look too eager. Margaret's face coloured slightly, perhaps from the heat in the kitchen, and continued on to the inn's main entrance, where she stopped to discuss something with her employer. Afterwards, Edward was surprised and delighted when Margaret headed right to his table. "Well, hello, Lord Edward. Fancy seeing you here again." I know, I'm back far too soon. I simply couldn't stay away from the food." Said Margaret, putting a hand on her hip. "That, and I imagine you're also looking to discuss the end of the new Austen novel." Edward did want to discuss that, but he'd been so distracted thinking of Margaret all day, multiple times, he'd found himself rereading the same set of sentences, absorbing nothing. "Unfortunately, I do still have several chapters left to go." Margaret gave him a sly look. "In that case, once you do finish it, I'll hope to have the pleasure of conversing with you here again." Edward would sing if his sense of pitch weren't so wanting. "It's a promise, Miss Andrews." Margaret had to return to the kitchen after that. It was quite a busy evening, but every time she left the kitchen to convene with her employer, over supplies they were short of, or new ideas for certain recipes, she made a point to stop at Edward's table and pick up from where they'd left off in their conversation. He tried to eat slowly, but even once he was done, he didn't want to leave. He ordered dessert for the second night in a row. At this rate, were he to receive any substantial inheritance, he would blow it almost immediately on sweet custards. Late day shifted to evening, and evening into night. Patrons cycled in and out, until eventually only a few tables remained occupied. Edward watched from across the room as Margaret officially shut the door for the evening, signalling to any new prospective patrons that the kitchen had closed. "Goodness," she said as she reapproached Edward's table. She shook her head, laughing slightly with exhaustion. "I am worn down to the bone." "Would you like to have a seat?" Margaret glanced back at the kitchen, hesitant. "Oh, I'm not sure." "Please," said Edward, hoping he didn't sound demanding. He desired the further pleasure of Margaret's company, but he didn't want to remind her any more of Robert than what was already unavoidable. "If your employer questions it, I will take full responsibility." Margaret still seemed a little hesitant, but took the seat across from Edward nonetheless. "You care a great deal about your employer's opinion," Edward noted. Margaret nodded. "Yes, and for his well-being. He's done a great deal for me." "Do you mind if I ask how so?" A weariness came over Margaret at his question. Edward was reminded of the first time he saw her, when she left the table with that family. The way her joy had morphed so suddenly into a private somberness. For all her mirth and smiles, perhaps Margaret was not as happy as Edward originally thought. Perhaps even Margaret wasn't as happy as she wished to envision herself. Edward understood how that could be. "My father passed away not too long ago," Margaret said at last, staring at a swollen spot on the table's wood. "My employer, Mr. Tatham, was my father's oldest friend. Though they hadn't spoken for quite some time when I came knocking on his door." She laughed, a low, sad noise, and tilted her head back, blinking away tears. When I came to London, I thought I could be a governess, or even a tutor. As it turns out, just because I want something doesn't mean it wants me back. Her eyes found Edward's once again. Her smile wobbled. I don't mean to get so emotional, I'm sorry. Don't be, Edward said, all seriousness. He wished he could reach across the table and wipe the dampness from her cheeks. I lost my mother at a young age, I understand. Edward didn't add that he'd lost his mother largely due to his own weakness. Margaret's situation almost certainly didn't mirror his in that way, and he didn't want to make this moment about him. In any case, said Margaret, shaking her head and wiping at her own eyes, I was so happy just moments ago. It seems a shame for our conversation to move in such a morbid direction. Edward didn't necessarily agree, but he didn't want to force Margaret to talk about something that would bring her pain. Tell me then, what's the best book you've ever read? At that question, Margaret's smile sparked back to its usual brimming self. Oh, shame. That's a wicked thing to ask someone like me. It is. I've never been able to answer it for myself. Why should you think you can evade it now, Lord Edward? Evade it? Yes, evade it. What's your favourite book? I just admitted I don't have an answer. Margaret leaned forward, her ribcage pressed against the edge of the table. Then tell me a handful of your favourites. I find the contents of a person's bookshelf are a great measure by which to know the contents of their mind. And their heart, Edward added softly. Yes. Margaret's smile was warmth, pure warmth, and their heart. They stared at one another for a long moment. Edward felt his face growing hot. He sat back and averted his eyes, cleared his throat. I do believe I asked you first. Margaret sat back as well and hummed. All right then, let's see. She listed a handful of titles. Edward was familiar with all of them, but one in particular had a special place in his heart. It was the first book he'd finished all on his own. Mother used to read to him and Robert in the evening, her voice low, soothing. Something about this one hooked him with an intensity none of the others had quite managed. He stayed up late in secret and snuck out of the bedroom he and Robert had once shared, scampering down the hall into the study, where he found the book and tried to sound out the unfamiliar scramble of letters, guided only by the light of the full moon, urging him on through the room's lone window. The most beautiful ending, Margaret said, closing her eyes and swaying to the music of words in her mind. And to life there is no greater delight than the breeze of one's true love, Edward finished. It was the last line of the book. The last time he'd discussed this with anyone, it had been Mother all those years ago. It was a surprisingly obscure title. He'd never met anyone else who had read it all the way through. Margaret seemed to feel similarly. She pressed a hand to her heart, eyes bright. Lord Edward, you do not know it, but you've done me a great courtesy. And what's that? I never thought I would meet someone who would appreciate those words as I do, much less speak them with the reverence they deserve. Their eyes locked again. Edward adored Margaret's face, not just its features but its expressions. The brightness of her eyes when she was excited, the soft, sombre shift of her sadness, though he hated to see her in any kind of pain. And then there were her lips, lush, lovely, parted ever so slightly. Edward jerked slightly backwards, his face burned. He'd actually been so egregiously bold as to lean in. How could he have been so inappropriate, so Robert-like? This was her workplace, for goodness sake. And Margaret had been so concerned about even just sitting with him. Margaret swallowed. She looked a little frazzled as well. Undoubtedly, Edward had made her uncomfortable with his rude impulse. I suppose I should finish closing up. She looked back towards the kitchen. The main dining hall was now completely empty, with the exception of Margaret's employer counting up the day's income at a booth by the front. A robust woman with heavy-lidded eyes sat across from him. most likely his wife. Edward rose, more careful than usual not to stumble. "I apologise for keeping you so long from your duties." "It's no matter," said Margaret, but she didn't meet his eyes. "Good night, Lord Edward." With that, she turned and headed swiftly to the kitchen. Edward watched her until the heavy door swung shut between them. He stood by the now vacant booth a moment longer. Then, with a defeated sigh, left for home. Chapter 7. Margaret's pulse didn't slow the entire way home. The longer she spent in Edward's presence, the more his very essence worked its way beneath her skin, inside her. She felt in turns hot, then cold, then hot again, almost as if she had a fever. When she at last sank into bed, the vision of the way he'd looked at her just before they'd said goodbye refused to leave her. He'd looked at her lips, leaned towards her. Had he meant to kiss me? Margaret was terrified that he had not, that perhaps she'd just had a bit of something on her face. But then, when she really thought about it, perhaps the prospect that he had meant, or at least desired, to kiss her was even more frightening. He was a Marquess. She, a lowly cook. Yes, they had delightful, fulfilling, even rapturous conversations. And yes, he was kind and sweet and sensitive in ways his twin or any other man Margaret had met was not. But it could never work. If she went along with this, or even went so far as to actively pursue it, what would be the result? Undoubtedly, a ruined reputation on her end, and even less chance of ever becoming a governess, or procuring a job that relied on her intellect rather than the labour of her hands. "You must quit this obsessing over Lord Edward," Margaret whispered at herself in the dark. "That's it. That's what you'll do. You'll quit obsessing and you can still converse about books. But that will be all." Of course, when she did sleep, all her dreams were about Edward. It was a few days before he returned to the Royal Lion, and despite her promise to herself, Margaret kept getting distracted by thoughts of the kind Marquess. When would he return? Would their conversations be as stimulating as before, or would their last interaction leave them too caught up in awkwardness to continue? Once, Margaret became so caught up in her daydreams, she sliced her thumb whilst chopping vegetables. Nick sent her to the staff room with a damp rag and told her to be more careful. It's good advice, Margaret thought, in regard to more than just her injured thumb. Still, it seemed merely daydreams were not enough. Margaret kept finding excuses to peruse the main dining hall and look for him, even when there was more than plenty to do in the kitchen. Rupert eventually got tired of Margaret venturing out of her workspace so often. Kindly but firmly he told her, "My dear Miss Andrews, surely you can manage to save these updates for after hours, when we can discuss them all at once." Margaret was hardly listening. There, across the room at long last, was Edward. "Of course," she answered, "I'll take care of it." "That's not what I—" But Margaret was already crossing the dining hall to where Edward sat at the concealed booth he seemed to favour. When he caught sight of her, his eyes brightened, but then his demeanour shifted into something more guarded. Margaret's own smile wavered as she reached the table. "My lord, it's been a good spell since I last saw you here." Edward's guardedness turned to confusion. "It's been 2 days, I believe." Surely he's been gone longer than that, Margaret thought. But after a moment of actually stopping to tally the time, she realised Edward was right. Goodness. "In any case," Edward hastened to say, "it felt long to me as well, especially since, well, I do believe I owe you an apology." "An apology?" He shifted in his seat. "In our last meeting, our conversation was such a welcome departure from the discussions I usually find myself engaged in. I believe I got a little too invested." Edward met her eyes. Was he embarrassed? "My lord, you have nothing to apologise for." Margaret added as much forcefulness as she could muster without raising her voice. "Then, Almost as if sharing a secret, she said, "I too found myself invested." "Oh, why would you say such a thing?" Margaret chastised herself. To think just yesterday she'd been warning herself to be careful. Now here she was, practically throwing herself at a man so far above her status he might as well be living on a cloud. In an attempt to shift the conversation quickly away, perhaps Edward wouldn't have time to fully process what she'd just said, Margaret asked, "What sort of discussions do you usually find yourself in?" Her tactic worked. Edward's face darkened. He looked away. "Arguments, mostly. You can imagine my brother and I don't particularly get along." That Margaret could believe. Edward shook his head, as if to rid himself of unpleasant thoughts. "In any case, I did think it important to return today, not just to apologise, but to discuss the ending of the Austen novel." Margaret's heart sparked. "Oh, you finished it?" "I did." "It was excellent, wasn't it? I love all of her material, of course, but this one seems yet another step above." Margaret realised she was gushing and attempted to tone herself down. "At least those were my thoughts. I value your thoughts." "And I yours," said Margaret quickly. Only then did Edward's words really land with her. "No one has ever given me such a compliment before." Edward frowned and leaned forward. "Surely that can't be the case." "I'm afraid it is. Ridiculous. You're the most intelligent young woman I've ever met." Margaret huffed a laugh. "Tell that to the households I applied to when I first arrived in London. I'd originally hoped to work in a position that involved reading or education." She shook her head. "Difficult to come by with few contacts." Before Edward could respond, commotion cut in from across the dining hall. Margaret looked over her shoulder. Yet another large group had just poured through the front door. The Royal Lion seemed to have become quite popular for multitudinous get-togethers. "I must return to the kitchen," Margaret told Edward, not without regret. "But—" "I intend to stay for a while," Edward said. Then that look of hesitation returned. "Of course, I don't mean to assume—" "You don't need to assume," said Margaret. "Away with caution, at least in this regard. You came to discuss that ending." She smiled. "I would not be doing my job if I allowed you to make such a trip in vain." Chapter 8. "That is it," said Robert, dropping his cutlery onto his plate with a rude clatter. "We must find a replacement for that sad old hag immediately." Rebecca, who'd been humming around her breakfast, went instantly still and silent. "Tell me, what's brought on this latest display of directionless rage?" Edward asked, leaning back in his chair, trying to mirror Robert's usual enraging aloofness. "The brat is singing, at the table." "She's happy." "She's obnoxious," said Robert, glaring at their little sister. "Everything she does grates on my nerves, the way she talks, the way she dresses." He laughed, bitter and cruel. "Even when she's not doing anything at all, just sitting there like she's slow of mind, I cannot stand her stupid sunny presence." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "'Scuse me," she mumbled, before jumping to her feet and scampering off to her room. Edward turned to Robert. He felt like an inferno raged in his chest. "Can we not have one pleasant breakfast?" "It's not my fault she's a sensitive little brat." "You must ease up, brother. What does Rebecca humming at the table have to do with a new governess anyway?" "As I've said, she needs to be taught manners." "If just her presence annoys you so, perhaps the fault lies not with our sister, but with you." In the span of a second, Robert's face went from twisted to unnervingly calm. He shrugged, sat back, took a casual bite of fruit. "Nothing is wrong with me. If anything, I'm the only one in this family with any sense of how the world really is." Edward knew it was bait. He knew it. He also couldn't help himself. "Do enlighten me. In what ways are you so worldly, and I so ignorant?" Robert's eyes glinted. "Isn't it obvious?" When Edward didn't answer, he shrugged and tossed the half-eaten fruit back on his plate, before shoving the whole dish away. You're so dreamy, so hopeful. It's nauseating." He turned his eyes toward the ceiling, as if put upon by Edward's very presence. "Honestly, you're worse than the brat, acting so hurt and surprised when real people don't behave like your storybook heroes." A memory came unbidden. It was the early years when he and Robert were small and still, truly identical. Mother always read to them in the study. They would curl up on the big seat by the window, soft sunlight drifting in. As Mother's smooth voice washed over them, Edward often closed his eyes, letting his imagination compile the images into a lovely whole. Robert, oppositely, had trouble keeping calm enough to stay seated. Once, in some adventure story, he jumped up onto the chair, unable to help himself, and demanded, "What's next? What happens next, Mother?" In the present, Edward's throat felt thick. If you tried, even once, to see more than the very worst in the world, perhaps you wouldn't be so miserable. Robert hesitated, then laughed. "Oh, the agony, the drama! Poor broken brother, how pitiable to be incapable of doing anything besides lecturing me on why I'm so miserable." He stood abruptly and swung his arms out wide. "I have no cause to be miserable. I'm soon to be Duke of Somerset, and in the meantime I'll have the pleasure of a lovely new young governess joining our staff." Edward sat back and sighed. "How have we only just had breakfast, and already I'm exhausted?" Of course his own weariness didn't matter, and he could worry about Robert's well-being later, assuming he didn't first go mad and murder his brother in his sleep. Right now, Rebecca was the one who needed an ally. "Let me choose the replacement," said Edward, setting his cutlery definitively on either side of his plate. Robert abandoned his grandiose pose and regarded Edward, surprised. "You? Why? Perhaps you're not the only one inclined to enjoy a fresh new face around the household." Robert studied him. Edward resisted the impulse to shift in his seat. All he truly cared about was finding someone who would be good for Rebecca. If the only way to do that was by playing into Robert's nonsense for a bit, so be it. Finally, Robert's face stretched into a grin. "Well, that will be entertaining. And here I'd thought women held no interest for you cripples. Is it me, or are your insults becoming less creative by the hour?" Robert tutted, unaffected. He began gathering his materials to depart, of course leaving his place setting a mess for the serving staff. "If you'd like the responsibility of choosing our sister's next tutor, by all means go ahead. It will be on you if she remains too stupid and obnoxious to ever land a respectable suitor." With that, Robert departed, leaving Edward alone in the large room. He looked down at his barely touched congealing eggs. They'd long gone cold. With a sigh, Edward shoved his seat back from the table and left for his study. It would be so much easier if Robert were a stranger. Then Edward could have a go at him properly, or better yet, ignore him altogether. Edward wasn't naive, despite what his brother thought. He knew there were bad people in the world, people beyond redemption. It was just hard, knowing his own twin was likely one of them. If Mother were still here, she would know what to do about Robert. Hell. If she were still here, perhaps Robert wouldn't have ended up like this in the first place. Stop it. Mother's gone. Living in a land of what-ifs helps no one. Edward needed to help Rebecca. His sister deserved only the best. For everything Edward couldn't control, he was determined to do right by her in this. But who? Someone educated, of course, but also kind, gentle. Rebecca was sensitive, but who could blame her? She'd grown up motherless, and given Father's distance and Robert's cruelty, no one had ever looked out for her except Edward and Dorothy. Edward opened the door to the study. There, on the side table, was the book with the gorgeous ending he and Margaret had bonded over. The previous night, he'd unearthed it from deep within the massive shelves encircling the little seating area. The sight of its worn cover left him feeling both nostalgic for the past and hopeful for the future. Rightfully so, Edward thought, as an uncontrollable smile took over his face. How could I have failed to think of her sooner? "I'm not sure," said Margaret, when they finally had a chance to converse later that afternoon. The Royal Lion was busier than ever. Word had to be getting around town about the excellent new cook. Edward felt a little guilty about trying to poach her, but hadn't Margaret hoped to become a governess upon moving to London in the first place? "Not sure?" Edward echoed, confused. "It's not that it isn't a tremendous opportunity," Margaret hastened to specify. "It's everything I've ever wanted. It's the future I've dreamed about." She bit her lip, almost as if questioning her own hesitation. "It's just, you feel loyalty to your current employer?" Margaret's eyes widened. She nodded quickly, more stressed, as if the idea had only just occurred to her at Edward's prompting. "Why, yes, that too." "But it's not your primary reason for hesitating." Margaret looked away. She fiddled with a loose thread on her dress. Was that a blush, colouring her cheeks? "No," she said quietly. "That's not my primary reason." Edward frowned, and then he understood. He'd been so excited on the way to the inn, thrilled at the prospect of seeing Margaret every day, prematurely proud of the effect he knew she would have on Rebecca. Now his ever-present rage towards his brother returned, all the more vicious for having been momentarily set aside. Edward reached out and took Margaret's hand. She jumped a little in surprise, but then allowed herself to be pulled closer to the table. To Edward. "He will not touch you, Miss Andrews. He will not insult you." Edward allowed himself to be honest with the intensity put into this promise. Truly, he would not be able to live with himself were he to put such a kind, virtuous woman in harm's way. "I will not allow it." Margaret, mouth slightly open, stared intently into Edward's eyes. There was fear in them, uncertainty. But slowly, her brow unfurrowed. "All right," Margaret said, voice serious yet soft. She squeezed his hand. "I trust you." Chapter 9. Margaret expected Edward to hail from an impressive estate. Of course, her guesswork hardly did Lockwood Manor justice. It was a stunning home, the sort of building that reminded one of a countryside vacation, despite its convenient location just outside of London's centre. The groundskeeping was impeccable, with fresh flowers lining the windows and a light, earthy scent wafting through the air. The living quarters Margaret had just vacated were far homelier. One small window, old partially rotted wood. A mouse problem. The place had been hers, though, and she'd loved it. She would miss it. Slowly, with trepidation in every step, Margaret tightened her grip on her belongings and moved towards the front entrance. She set her bag down and knocked softly on the door. It swung open immediately. A woman with red hair and drooping jowls greeted her with a sequence of nods and a big smile. "Miss Andrews, we've been expecting you." "Oh," said Margaret, a little caught off guard by the expressive greeting. This way. Let's take care to get you settled. Lots of introductions to be made, after all." The housemaid, Ruby, took Margaret's bag and escorted her up the stairs to her new sleeping quarters. It was a small but clean room, with a sizable window looking out over the courtyard. "This is lovely," Margaret said, surveying the space. She ran a hand over the bedding. Even when Father had been alive, Margaret had never had the pleasure of such nice accommodations. The previous governess had a room closer to the rest of the staff quarters, but Lord Edward insisted you were to be provided with nothing short of the best. Margaret turned and faced Ruby. The maid was looking at her shrewdly, as if she hoped Margaret might explain this seemingly odd gesture at the hands of their mutual employer. Margaret was at just as much of a loss. "You mentioned further introductions to be made?" "Of course. This way." As they manoeuvred through the decorated halls of the manor, Margaret found herself tensing up at the slightest sign of movement, nervous at the prospect of running into either of the Lockwood brothers. Edward hadn't been incorrect when he'd assumed Margaret's hesitation in accepting his offer of employment had to do with her feelings toward Robert. Even so, when he'd asked her to come and work for their family, Margaret's largest, most secret concern had been the way Edward made her feel. At turns shy and overly bold, and in either case a step removed from control of her own body. It was one thing to see Edward every day at the Royal Lion, another to be near him in his home all hours of the week. "Here we are," said Ruby at last, entering a door at the far end of the hall. Margaret followed her into the drawing room, and sure enough, there was Edward, speaking in a low, soothing voice to a little girl with whom he shared a remarkable resemblance. "My lord," said Ruby with a short incline of her head, "Miss Andrews has arrived." Edward sat upright from where he'd been leaning forward to speak to the little girl and smiled. "Miss Andrews, I'm so happy to have you joining us here. May I introduce my sister, Rebecca?" Margaret was just about to greet Rebecca herself when the little girl got to her feet and offered a short curtsy. Her eyes darted this way and that as she offered a quiet, "Hello." While a moment previous Margaret had been caught up in her own anxieties over being in such regular proximity to Edward, she found her heart now going out to this small girl, at once so polite and so shy. Margaret had been much the same way as a child, intrigued by those around her, yet terrified of new faces. Margaret put as much warmth into her smile as she could muster and approached Rebecca. She lowered herself just slightly, not so much as to be improper, but enough that she could speak to the little girl more on her own level. "It's a great pleasure to meet you, Lady Rebecca," Margaret said. "My name is Miss Andrews. Your brother has told me a great deal of positive things about you, and I must say, I'm quite looking forward to getting to know you myself." Rebecca seemed taken aback by the praise. She bit her lip and glanced up quickly at her brother, who laughed and patted her head fondly. "As I believe I mentioned earlier, Rebecca can be a touch shy," Edward said. "As can I," said Margaret with a laugh, righting herself. She smiled back at Rebecca. "We can all be a little shy at times. That doesn't mean we don't have things worth saying." At this, Rebecca's eyes brightened. "Edward says you read all the same books as he does." "We have read a lot of the same material, that's true. I want to get better at reading. Every time I try and pick up a book on my own, it takes me ages to get all the way through." Rebecca wrinkled her nose and glared playfully up at her brother. "I'd like to discuss the stories with Edward, but he always finishes them before me and moves on before I can." Edward looked faux abashed. His words were addressed to Rebecca, but he was making eye contact with Margaret. "Do forgive me, my dear. I didn't realize my reading habits were giving you such trouble." "That's all right," said Rebecca with a shrug. This time, when she glanced back at Margaret, there was a shrewdness to her look Margaret hadn't expected. "You're going to stay and teach me, so I'll be even faster at reading than Edward. Right, Miss Andrews?" "Yes, my dear," said Edward, still looking at Margaret. "If I have my way, Miss Andrews will be here for a long time yet to come." Margaret had hoped that once she met Rebecca and had the chance to recontextualize Edward here in his home, her nerves might lessen. Of course, when Ruby returned and announced the Duke of Somerset himself was feeling well enough to host them for tea, Margaret's pulse sped up to the point she could hear it pounding in her ears. "I'm only here because Edward believes me suitable for the position," Margaret thought, as Ruby marched both her and Edward towards the Duke's quarters. "If the Duke finds reason to disagree, will I be forced to return to the Royal Lion?" The thought of what she would have to say to Rupert to get her old job back left Margaret reeling with light nausea. Edward must have been able to tell something was off, because as Ruby entered the Duke's quarters to announce their presence, he tapped the back of Margaret's hand. She jerked to attention. "Are you all right?" Edward asked quietly. Margaret could only take a shaky breath and nod. The way Edward was looking at her was at once both kind and driven. It was the sort of look that said, "We will get through this together." Margaret's fears eased. Moments later, she and Edward sat together at a small table that had been placed at His Grace's bedside. While Ruby went to fetch the tea, Edward introduced his father to Margaret, and Margaret to his father. "It's an honour, Your Grace," said Margaret. "Thank you for opening your home to me, and for this opportunity." Said the Duke, glaring as he studied her. Margaret tried not to let the harsh look spike her nerves again. She instead resolved to study him right back. There was a resemblance between him and his sons, but only a slight one. The boys must have favoured their late mother. Yet there was something of Edward in the Duke's face. Margaret couldn't quite put her finger on precisely what it was. "You have a sharp eye about you," said the Duke at last, speaking with more clarity than Margaret had expected from the sickly man. "Forgive me, Your Grace," said Margaret, inclining her head. "Though my purpose here is to educate young Lady Rebecca, I hope to learn new things myself, wherever I am. I expect there is a lot I might learn from a family as respected as yours." The Duke's brows shot up. He cut his eyes over to his son. "Where did you find this one, Edward?" A spike of panic shot through Margaret, but Edward kept his face even. "I assure you, Miss Andrews is more than qualified." The Duke waved him away. He gave Margaret a sly look, almost like they were in on a secret together. "That's not what I mean. This one's got a silver tongue." Margaret was caught unaware by the Duke's apparent goodwill. It seemed Edward was as well. He regarded his father with his mouth slightly agape, like the man had suddenly become a stranger. They continued on with tea, and Margaret shared some of her past, but only snippets. Mostly she tried to keep her parts of the conversation focused on books she'd read, talents she'd developed, and instances in which she felt she'd demonstrated strong character. Edward seemed to be listening intently to this bit as well, which forced Margaret to do what she could to fight off a blush. When the meeting finally concluded, His Grace did begin to tire rather quickly, and Edward escorted Margaret out. He shook his head. The fever must have him in some sort of delirium. "He seemed quite sound of mind to me. If only. I've never seen him act so welcoming to a newcomer on the staff, much less—" Edward seemed to think better of what he was going to say and locked his jaw tight. "What is it?" Margaret prompted. They'd stopped walking, lingering now in the turn of the hall where Margaret would need to turn away if she was to properly unpack before dinner. Edward looked at her, like he was weighing whether to move forward with saying whatever personal information had just cut off their conversation. Margaret, with a boldness that left her half exasperated with herself, reached forward and touched the back of Edward's hand, lightly, ever so lightly, just as he'd done for her before the meeting with the Duke. She was not prepared for Edward to literally shiver at the touch. They both blinked in surprise. Edward, however, quickly shook off the odd reaction. And really perhaps it wasn't a reaction to anything Margaret had done at all, perhaps he was just cold, and said, "Father favours Robert." "I'm sure that's not—" "It is, to an extreme degree. I was expecting, well, in all honesty, Miss Andrews, I was expecting to have to argue with him on your behalf. Not because there's anything lacking in your qualifications." Edward hastened to add off of Margaret's panicked look. "Rather, I'd expected he would take a dislike to you purely because I was the one vying for you to be the governess." Margaret didn't know what to do with this information. Surely Edward had to be mistaken. How could a father with someone as odious as Robert for one son, and someone as kind and patient as Edward for the other, favour the former? "Your father seemed quite kind to me," Margaret said slowly. She met Edward's eyes, fearful of accidentally dismissing his feelings. But first impressions don't always give one the full picture, do they? Something darkened in Edward's gaze. Only then did Margaret become fully aware that they were alone in the hall. Alone, and standing quite close. "I don't believe I fully agree," he said, voice quiet. Almost like now he was the one sharing a secret. "I believed you were exceptional from the first moment I saw you. Time has only proved me more right." Margaret's heart jumped to her throat. Edward blinked, like he too was surprised by the intensity of the words that had just left his mouth, and took a step back. "Thank you," said Margaret, feeling dizzy. "After all the words that you've read, Surely you could have come up with something better than thank you. Edward cleared his throat. The day is getting late. Perhaps I should leave you to get settled. That was the last thing Margaret wanted. She wanted to stay with Edward and have him continue the tour of the manor. They might even spend some time together in the study he'd mentioned in their earliest conversations, to take a look at the Lockwood's vast library. But Margaret was already at high risk of overstepping. "Very well," she said, taking her own step back. "May the remainder of your afternoon be a pleasant one, my lord." Chapter 10. When the dinner hour neared, Margaret shook off her lingering thoughts of Edward and joined in to eat with the rest of the staff. While she enjoyed the company of her new peers, she did find herself missing Rupert and Nick. Of course, they had wished her well upon her departure, insisting that she needed to pursue the line of work most suited to her own goals and desires. Nick had even gone so far as to shed a tear. "It's been a joy and a pleasure cooking alongside you," he'd said. "Indeed," Rupert had echoed, warmth in his voice as he handed Margaret her final wages. "Even in your short tenure here, you've increased our business for years yet to come. We would welcome your return at any point in the future, whether that be as staff or a patron." The meal prepared by the Lockwood kitchen staff was nothing to look down on. It was savoury and filling, and Margaret found herself trying to guess what spices they'd used. Not that it mattered, now that Margaret would no longer be cooking for work. It was a sad thought, as she'd grown to appreciate the art of cooking. Yet she'd also been quite tired while working at the Royal Lion, to the point that exhaustion felt like her default, relieved only by the pages of an extraordinary book or Edward's presence. Living in a great manor like this, and tutoring a sweet girl like Rebecca will surely be easier by far, Margaret thought, taking a sip of her drink. She couldn't help but remember back to her early days in London, going from townhouse to townhouse offering her services, only to be declined over and over again, her hopes slipping with each new residence she approached. With a swell of warmth, Margaret had a moment of profound awareness. She'd gotten what she wanted, what she'd come to London for in the first place. It was all thanks to Edward. "I demand to know who is responsible for this sickeningly cold broth." "Oh." Robert's voice stopped short in the doorway. "It's you." Margaret's whole body went stiff at the Marquess's sudden presence. She'd thought herself safe here in the kitchen, where only the staff was to be expected. She'd always been safe in the Royal Lion's kitchen. "My lord," said one of the members of the serving staff, getting to his feet, "if there is a problem with your meal, rest assured we shall correct it immediately." "Hush, hush now," said Robert, waving the man away without looking at him. No, his eyes were only on Margaret. A devilish grin crept onto his face as he approached her, whatever issue he'd come to address regarding the meal forgotten. "You're that comely wench from the oyster bar. What is it you're called?" Though her mouth had gone dry, Margaret found her voice. "My lord, I don't believe you heard this man correctly." She nodded at the staff member whom Robert had just interrupted. "As he's just offered to correct your meal, there is really no more reason for you to be in the staff quarters at all." It seemed as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. The other staff members made panicked eye contact with one another across the table. Margaret felt her heart might beat right out from between her ribs, but she managed to keep eye contact with Robert and hold her ground. Robert's face grew red with rage. "How dare you speak to me in such a manner?" "I spoke to you in no particular manner at all," she said. "I was merely echoing this good man's assurance that the dinner would be corrected. You no longer need to trouble yourself." The sound of uneven footsteps came from just outside the door to the dining room. Edward appeared at Robert's side, looking flustered. "Robert, this is uncalled for." "Did you hear the way she spoke to me?" "I did, and from my perspective it was more than merited." Edward stepped between his brother and Margaret. "Please, kindly rejoin Rebecca and me in the dining room." Margaret thought she saw the slightest note of surprise flash through Robert's eyes, but she couldn't be sure. As quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced with fiery, mocking ire. "Oh, dear brother, forgive me. It seems you fancy the little wench. I so hope I haven't offended her." "Get gone, Robert," Edward growled. Robert raised a hand to cup his ear and raised an eyebrow, smiling in that odious way of his. "What was that?" I said, "Get gone." For all Margaret loathed Robert, watching the brothers go at each other like this, in front of their staff over her, was too much, far, far too much. "Please, stop," she said, voice small, at last turning her eyes away. "Let him call me what he must." Edward looked at her, hurt. "Miss Andrews, all will be well," said Margaret, forcing a smile. She tried not to look directly at Robert, though she could feel his eyes on her, full of cruel mirth at this small victory. "Please do not allow me to cause further interruption to your meals." Robert inclined his head, still smiling. "As you wish, wench." With that, he left the staff quarters. Edward stood there a moment longer, apparently at a loss, taking in the way the rest of the serving staff had trained their eyes resolutely at their plates. At last, his own eyes found Margaret's. He gave her a look that was at once an apology and a promise to follow up later, then exited the room after his brother. Margaret released her breath. Silently the serving staff resumed their meal, with the exception of the man who had promised to address whatever was wrong with Robert's food. No one said another word to Margaret the entire evening. Chapter 11. Edward couldn't sleep. Of course this wasn't unusual, and he hadn't been lying in bed for very long anyway. But tonight was different. He'd been so excited to have Margaret here with him in Lockwood Manor. But he'd also promised to shield her from Robert. How have I failed so quickly? His thoughts were consumed by distress over what Margaret had to be feeling right now. Was she in her room, alone, afraid, disappointed, convinced Edward couldn't protect her after all? It wouldn't be such a far stretch. Edward's limbs felt hot with shame at his own presumption, at trusting that she could trust him in this manner. He was a cripple. He couldn't protect anyone. "Find a way," Edward whispered into the dark. "Fix this." Edward knew that what he was about to do wasn't exactly proper. Far from it, really, and he hoped by taking this risk he wouldn't end up distressing Margaret even further. But he couldn't rest until he addressed what happened. Hopefully, offering even a small bit of reassurance might do Margaret well as well. Edward lit the candle on his nightstand and reattached the prosthetic leg he'd removed for sleep. As silently as he could manage, Edward crept from his room and down the hall. When he reached Margaret's new quarters, he looked both ways to make sure there wasn't anyone else awake and moving about the hall, then knocked lightly on her door. Perhaps she's already asleep, Edward thought suddenly. Blast it, not everyone has insomnia. What if you've just gone and woken her up? Before Edward could come up with the words to apologise for waking Margaret up, the door opened, and there she was. Edward's breath hitched. Margaret closed the door to hide herself almost immediately upon seeing who had come calling, but not before Edward got a glimpse of her thin, linen nightwear. "Yes, my lord?" she said, a blush colouring her cheeks. "It's all right," said Edward. "I'm sorry if I've awoken you or interrupted your evening. I just... Miss Andrews, I'm so ashamed for what happened earlier." Margaret offered a small smile. "You apologising on behalf of your brother is a behaviour I'm afraid I'm accustomed to." "I'm apologising for him, yes, but I'm also apologising for myself. I told you I would protect you." Margaret's face grew serious. She drew herself taller from some internal well of determination and with complete conviction said, "You did protect me. You got him out of that kitchen. And you'll keep protecting me where it counts. I know you will." Edward kissed her. It was a soft, light thing, gently placed on her velvety lips. Edward hadn't meant to do it, and immediately felt embarrassed, especially at Margaret's little squeak of surprise. But seeing her in her nightclothes, and then the way she'd spoken about him with such unwavering confidence. How am I to help myself? Even so, there were some things that just weren't done. "I'm sorry," Edward said, pulling away. "I should—" Margaret caught his hand as he turned to leave. This time, it was no small accidental caress. She squeezed it tightly and said, "For someone so good of heart, you apologize far too often." At his look of confusion, she continued, smiling. "Have no shame, for you must have read my thoughts. Good night, Edward." She released his hand and closed the door. Edward stood there a moment longer. It was as if flowers were blooming in his chest. He felt floaty, fluttery, completely removed from the earth. The closest comparison Edward could make to the feeling he had now was the sensation of finishing a truly incredible book. Everything felt different now. He felt different, better than before, fuller. Some of the greatest books he'd read had described this very feeling as well. Edward had come across these descriptions so often there was no doubt as to exactly what was going on. "You love her," he thought to himself, more than a little stunned, "and it seems possible she may love you too." Chapter 12. Margaret replayed the kiss through her mind late into the night and on through breakfast the next morning. The feel of Edward's soft lips, the way her own body had shivered in response. The whole experience had her feeling lightheaded with a mix of joy and anxiety. Not to mention it was officially her first day serving as young Lady Rebecca Lockwood's governess. Impeccable timing, as always, Margaret. She chastised herself as she set up the materials for their first lesson. But for all Margaret knew, she was getting into a dubious situation, and for all she believed the correct response was to be angry and self-shaming. It had been a very persuasive kiss. "You seem more nervous than I feel," Rebecca said, sitting back in her chair approximately half an hour into their session. It wasn't meant as a rude or insensitive comment. It was just a child being blunt and observant in the way children often were, at least when they were comfortable. Margaret took Rebecca's forwardness as a good sign. "I suppose you're right," Margaret said, sitting back from their study materials as well. "It can be frightening to begin new things." "That's true," said Rebecca with a slight shrug. She looked away and her little face clouded. "I like you quite a lot, Miss Andrews. But I do miss Dorothy." The way Rebecca said this was almost as if she was admitting to something shameful. "You're allowed to miss her," Margaret said. "I wouldn't expect you not to." "Robert thinks I'm too needy." Margaret pressed her lips into a tight line. Regardless of her own feelings towards Robert, it wouldn't be appropriate to voice such negativity to Rebecca about her older brother. "We haven't known each other long, so I'm not sure how much my opinion ought to count for," said Margaret. "But I think you are a charming young person with a big heart. Regardless of what Robert thinks, I believe that alone will take you a long way." Rebecca grinned. "That sounds more like Edward than me." Perhaps it does, thought Margaret, and felt herself blush. "In any case," she said out loud, hoping the little girl hadn't caught on to her reaction, "why don't we refrain from moving forward with this material for a bit? I'd like to learn more about Miss Dorothy. What did the two of you enjoy doing together?" The rest of the lesson soothed any remaining anxieties Margaret had about her new position. Once Rebecca understood it was safe to discuss not only her schoolwork but her feelings with Margaret, they got on as if they'd known each other for years. They were off to an excellent start. Of course, Margaret's feelings of unthreatened ease evaporated as soon as it came time for lunch. As soon as she stepped into the hall, she ran right into Edward. This was certainly welcomed, but nevertheless sent her heart stampeding in her chest once more. "My lord," she greeted him. Smiling, he slipped her a note. With shaking hands, Margaret unfolded the paper. It was a poem. She read the first few lines to herself, but found herself mouthing the ending out loud. for every hope, for every fear, for every thought I do hold dear. I find I can no longer flee the feelings you inspire in me." Margaret looked up at Edward. His face was bright red. With a sheepish grin, he said, "I suppose I wasn't expecting you to read it out loud." A wave of affection washed over Margaret. "I do believe you are the sweetest soul I've ever met." "I'm more than just sweet," said Edward, taking a step closer. "That must be undoubtedly true," Margaret replied. Her eyes ticked down to his lips and then back up again. "Miss Andrews?" "His Grace would like to meet with you," said Ruby, appearing suddenly at the top of the stairs. Margaret took a swift step back, as did Edward. "Very well," Margaret said, smoothing down her dress, though it hadn't been rumpled. Really, Margaret herself felt rumpled. She wished she could smooth down her emotions as easily as she could cloth. "I'll accompany you there." Edward bid her a regretful farewell and continued on his own way. Margaret tucked the poem safely away in the pocket of her dress and took a deep breath before following Ruby onwards to the Duke's quarters. "Do you know what this is in regard to?" Margaret asked Ruby as they approached the door. "I would assume your new role as governess." "Of course, you're surely right." Margaret hoped that was the case anyway. She didn't believe anyone had seen her and Edward last night, but if they had, she didn't doubt the Duke would have her tossed out on the street before dinner. Ruby announced Margaret's arrival, and then she once again entered into the presence of the Duke of Somerset, this time without Edward's support. She hesitated, shifting her weight by the door. Come now, Miss Andrews," said the Duke, motioning her to sit in one of the chairs at his side. "I called you in here to converse with me, not hover in the threshold." Feeling like a puppet on strings, Margaret made her way forward. She took a seat beside the Duke, aware of every movement. "How might I be of service to you, my lord?" "To start with, you can tell me about this morning's first session with my daughter." The Duke made his voice stern, but there was a sincerity to his eyes that wasn't lost on Margaret. "How is she doing? What do you think of her?" This was an easy enough question to answer honestly. "Well, while we've only had our first lesson, from what I can tell, Rebecca is highly intelligent for her age." "Is she? You sound surprised." No, it's not that. She's a Lockwood. Of course she would be intelligent." His face darkened. "It's simply that Robert, Edward's brother, thinks she hasn't been making as much progress as she should." The Duke met Margaret's eyes then. There was a question there, or maybe a challenge. Margaret desperately wished she could tell which. "With all due respect to the Marquess," Margaret said slowly, "in my professional opinion, I believe Rebecca is actually quite advanced. Perhaps if you were to share that with him, it might put some of his worries at ease." It wasn't the right answer. The Duke's face darkened further. Margaret fidgeted in her seat. Perhaps she shouldn't have contradicted Robert, who Edward was apparently convinced was the favourite son. "No, you owe it to Rebecca to be her advocate. That is your duty here." "Forgive me, Your Grace," Margaret heard herself say, "but you seem to be deep in contemplation. Is there anything further I might elaborate on or assist you with?" The Duke looked at her, and his face softened. "No, Miss Andrews, I apologise if I seem stormy as of late. His words stopped abruptly, consumed by a coughing fit. Margaret froze. Images of her own father in his final days erupted to the forefront of her thoughts. "Your Grace, if I may—" Margaret reached out a hand to help balance the Duke's frame. He'd seemed a tall man, well built, even reclining as he was. Yet as soon as Margaret touched him, she could feel his frailness, the way bones poked against his skin. She ignored the unpleasant feeling associated with the touch and began conducting one of the breathing exercises she'd done with her own father. In, twice, quickly. Out, once, slowly. Repeat. Once the Duke had recovered, he shook her off weakly, a bit red in the face. Without making eye contact, he said, "I apologise. You shouldn't have to bear witness to such weakness." That last word was spat rather than said. "Your Grace," Margaret began, "I certainly don't wish to overstep my bounds, but I hope you will take me at my word when I say I don't believe illness makes one weak." The Duke looked at her, imploring. Margaret continued, "In fact, it is a testament to one's strength to weather such adversity, especially while continuing to operate a household, as is the situation in your case." "You are a kind woman, Miss Andrews," said the Duke at last, after a long moment of contemplative silence. Margaret could tell he didn't believe her. Chapter 13. Later that evening, Margaret found herself in the kitchen. It wasn't her job to be here, but she felt uncomfortable about what had happened at dinner the previous night and was hoping for a fresh start with the other members of the staff. "It wasn't your fault," the man who had fixed last night's cold stew situation told her quietly, as they worked together to tidy the counter area. "Lord Robert is—" "Lord Robert," Margaret finished for him, punctuating their shared commentary with a knowing look. As they cleaned, however, Margaret found herself thinking neither of Robert nor Edward, but of the Duke himself. He had seemed stern yet kind. But above all, if she was being honest, frightened. It must be difficult to have had such control throughout one's life, only to lose it so suddenly in old age. Margaret wished she understood more of what Edward had meant about the Duke favouring Robert. The Duke had seemed more than reasonable throughout their discussion. Was there something Margaret didn't know? She was so deep in thought that when the rest of the kitchen staff dwindled off to their own sleeping quarters, Margaret continued on, oblivious, scrubbing at a particularly troublesome pot that absolutely refused to get clean. "Well," came a deep voice behind her, "you're finally alone." It was close. Much, much too close. Margaret's hands stopped scrubbing. Her body was frozen yet buzzing to run away all at once. "Can I help you?" she asked, using all her might just to turn around. Robert stood over her. His shirt was askew, and his cheeks were red with alcohol flush. He smiled and set the brandy glass he carried down on the counter Margaret had just cleaned. A splash of the liquid spilled out. It would dry and go sticky within minutes. "In more ways than one, I hope," Robert said, looming over her further. Margaret expected him to step closer, to close the space between them, but he didn't, not right away. "My brother favours you, I see. That upsets me." Margaret's voice was a flat monotone. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do, Miss Andrews." Robert's faux jovial tone went cold. "I know you think him the kindly twin. Or perhaps he's more like an injured dog you've taken a liking to. But you're a governess now. That means you're supposed to be intelligent." He paused, as if offering a space for Margaret to respond. Margaret, however, had been slowly inching her hand backwards on the counter, towards the knife rack. She halted the motion under Robert's returned scrutiny. Thankfully, he hadn't picked up on what she was doing, and instead huffed a laugh. "You really can't see what's right in front of you." "What exactly is right in front of me, my lord? Other than your brandy-reeking breath, of course." Robert jolted at Margaret's words, perhaps not expecting her to be so blunt. The double standard was infuriating, but Robert continued on. "I saw you first," he hissed, "at that oyster bar. I know it, you know it, and my dear crippled brother knows it." He grinned. "The only reason he's interested in you at all is because you caught my attention. It's sad, really. The poor lad always wants what he can't have. A beautiful, charming woman at the top of that list, of course." With that, Robert lurched forward to grope at Margaret. She hadn't managed to get her hand on a knife, but it didn't matter. Robert was too intoxicated to maintain full coordination. It was the perfect opportunity. Margaret shoved him, hard. He fell to the ground with a great thud. "You are a beast!" she spat, and hurriedly headed for the door. "Miss Andrews!" Robert called, and to Margaret's surprise there were tears in his voice, Please wait." Margaret did not wait. However, as she rounded the corner of the exit, she did get one last glimpse of Robert. He sat on the floor, knees curled up tight, with his head in his hands. What a sad, pitiful excuse for a man, she thought. The moment she was back in her bedroom, Margaret locked the door. Her whole body was shaking when she climbed into bed. After lying there in the dark for a few minutes, she got up again and pushed her dresser in front of the door for good measure. She hoped no one else in the house was awakened by the sound of her shoving furniture around. "Think of Edward," she whispered into her pillow, curling tightly into herself. Edward. Only Edward. It took a long time, but eventually, after what felt like endless hours of Margaret repeating Edward's name, of mentally reciting what she'd memorized of the poem he'd written her, of reliving their kiss in her mind, she managed to disappear into sleep. Her dreams were messy, tumultuous. Edward was featured heavily and in embarrassing ways at that, touching her, caressing her, making her body his own. Margaret jolted awake well before dawn, her heart hammered, and with a rush of shame she resisted pressing against the damp ache between her thighs. "What are you doing?" she asked the dark room. Tears threatened at the edge of her vision. She had feelings for Edward, strong feelings, and she believed he had them for her as well. But she was still just a governess, and he was a Marquess. And as loath as she was to believe the words of a scoundrel like Robert, what if he was right? Chapter 14. Robert was quieter at breakfast than usual. Edward and Rebecca had given up waiting for him and were nearly done with their own meals by the time he slunk down the stairs and joined them, looking all sorts of dishevelled. "You look as though you had an interesting night," Edward commented dryly, when it seemed Robert wasn't planning to converse with them at all. To his surprise, Rebecca gave him a little kick under the table. While it wasn't exactly a polite gesture, Edward ticked his eyes over to hers in acknowledgement. He wasn't trying to provoke Robert. Not exactly. But something was wrong. "Robert," Edward pressed again, more gently this time. They were brothers after all, despite Robert's frequent attempts to make him forget that fact. Robert met his eyes at last. There was a deadness to them that caught even Edward off guard. "That new governess of yours needs to learn to dress properly," he said flatly, then returned his eyes to his barely picked-at food. "Properly?" Edward asked, confused. The first sparks of irritation itched under his skin. Whatever Robert was getting at, he was already certain he wouldn't like it. "Conservative," Robert said, harsher, stabbing at a sausage link with his fork. Edward made his voice flat, a warning. "She's more than conservative. Any time I've seen her, she has been the picture of modesty. If she was truly modest, I wouldn't be so tempted to rip her clothes off." Edward's mouth went dry. Rebecca looked up at him, her little brow furrowed. "Rip her clothes off?" "Edward, what does he mean?" Edward was shaking. He could barely control his rage. "Go on to your lessons, Rebecca." "But—" Robert sighed. "Listen to him, brat." Rebecca looked between them, but apparently her older brothers agreeing on an order, even if it was for a dark reason, seemed enough motivation for her to get gone. She scooted her chair back and left the room, throwing little glances back over her shoulder as she went. Once Edward was sure Rebecca was safely out of earshot, he levelled his brother with the iciest glare he could manage. "If you lay a finger on her, I will have your head." Robert just lifted an eyebrow. "Will you, brother?" "I will." How tragic, considering the deed is already done. Edward felt as if he was being consumed by flames from the inside out. Heat flashed across his vision, and suddenly he was lunging across the table, his hands around Robert's throat. "What have you done, you monster?" Robert didn't even look alarmed. He just stood up. The motion was swift, and it sent Edward off balance. He tripped to the side, releasing Robert's neck, and landed hard on the ground, his prosthetic leg at an odd angle. "Good luck fixing that," said Robert coldly, the mirth in his eyes a dark mockery of his usual teasing. The flames that had just moments ago swallowed Edward up turned instantly to a cold, congealed shame. He stared at the floor, blinking back tears and listening as Robert's footsteps retreated from the dining room. Moments later, he heard the front door of the manor open and close. Slowly, mechanically, he reattached his leg. Ruby rounded the corner then. When she spotted Edward on the ground, she rushed towards him. "My lord, are you—" "I'm fine," Edward bit out, waving her away. His face burned. "But are you quite—" "I said I'm fine, Ruby. Are you deaf?" Ruby pulled her outstretched hand back and cradled it to her chest, hurt. Edward felt immediate regret. Ruby was nothing but kind. She didn't deserve this, not from him. She got enough of it from Robert. Edward managed to get himself upright again, using the chair to balance. Once he had regained his balance, he brushed past her quickly, knowing he ought to apologize, but unable to muster enough focus to actually do so. Instead, he stormed down the hallway and into the drawing room. Margaret sat across from Rebecca, conversing quietly with a workbook between them. They didn't seem to be looking at the text at all. "Margaret," Edward said, voice thick. She looked up. Only then did Edward realize it was the first time he'd addressed her by her given name. Rebecca's eyebrows shot up. She looked between them. Margaret's face, however, clouded. "Excuse me for a moment," she said to Rebecca quietly, before getting up and following Edward just outside the door. He tried to keep his voice low. "Robert," he said. Margaret shook her head and glared at the floor. She looked to be holding back tears. Edward longed to reach out, to take her in his arms. He tried, but he was too drunk. "I should have been there." Margaret looked up sharply. "I was in the kitchens cleaning a pot. That's no place for you." "It's no place for you either, not now." Edward couldn't help the note of panic in his voice. "From now on, you should stay in the main parts of the house. I don't want him having another opportunity to catch you alone." Margaret's eyes narrowed. There was determination there and boldness. Still, her voice shook. "I can handle men like your brother." Edward regarded her, wishing he could understand everything she was feeling inside right now. He wanted to know the right thing to say, better yet, the right thing to do. But he couldn't understand. Not fully. With a sigh, he did the next best thing and took her hand in his, pressed his lips to the soft, cool skin of her knuckles. "I know you can. Even so, Margaret, you shouldn't have to. If you'd kept your promise and protected her like you said, she wouldn't," he thought as he turned to leave. Chapter 15. A new pattern fell into place after that day. Margaret spent the majority of her days with Rebecca, reading together, studying French, all the things a governess might be expected to do with a young pupil. Occasionally, Margaret would have tea with the Duke, and they would discuss the young girl's progress. Each evening Edward would always personally escort Margaret to her room. There were whispers amongst the staff. Margaret felt eyes on her at mealtimes, speculating glances, and now and again an offhand comment. But Edward hadn't kissed her again since that first night. Eventually, when it became clear that nearly all of their public discussions involved either books or Rebecca, the gossip dwindled off. Perhaps it was because of Edward's increased protectiveness, or perhaps he had fallen further into the drink for other reasons. But Robert disappeared immediately after dinner almost every night, rarely returning until late into the witching hour. Margaret knew this only because on the nights when she herself fell into the bad habit of reading by candlelight far later than was wise for a proper rest, she could hear Edward's brother open and close the front door, then stumble his way through the halls towards his own quarters. Once she'd heard the footsteps stop outside her door. He hesitated for a long, long moment, and then they were walking away. Margaret released her breath, heart hammering in her chest. She decided to make shoving the dresser in front of her door a habit whenever she slept, rather than an occasional occurrence. Still, as a whole, Robert presented much less of a threat than he had at the beginning. Sometimes entire weeks would pass without Margaret catching a glimpse of him at all. During these stretches, it was easier to spend her free time with Edward, the threat of his awful brother drifting to the background. In particular, they got into the habit of meeting in secret in Edward's study after dinner. This initially was just meant as a touch-base point for Margaret to communicate anything sensitive about Rebecca's progress, or on a darker note, to give Edward notice if Robert did begin giving her problems again. In time, however, Margaret found herself joining Edward in the study, even when there wasn't anything of particular consequence to discuss. Other than books, that is. And truly, wasn't that the most consequential conversation topic of all? Margaret's favourite version of these discussions came about on the cold nights, when she had an excuse to sit closer to Edward than normal by the fire. While logs crackled behind them, filling the small library space with the crisp, smoky scent of the hearth, they took turns reading passages of verses to one another. It was all fine, and quite typically, nothing short of lovely. Until one night, as Edward read to her, he stopped mid-sentence. He looked Margaret in the eye for a long, long moment. "What is it?" Margaret asked, crossing her arms over her lap self-consciously. Edward didn't answer her directly. Instead, he turned his eyes back to the book and continued, his voice dropping lower, more sensuous. Her lips dripped red nectar as she bit into the cherry, making them ever so inviting. His eyes darted up to meet hers again. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "He hasn't kissed me since that first night. Is that what he wants now? Is it what I want?" Nonsense, of course. Margaret knew what she wanted. She just wasn't sure whether it was a good idea. Even so, with the way Edward was looking at her, the fire reflected in his eyes, or maybe that heat was always there in his gaze, Margaret gave up. Slowly, ever so slowly, they mirrored one another, leaning in until their lips pressed together. Oh. What started as gentle, delicate, turned quickly into something that felt beyond either of their abilities to control. Bodies pressed closer, breathing picked up. Margaret's heart stuttered in her chest, blood pounding furiously. She wanted to be closer, and this time she took what she wanted. Edward jolted in surprise, but his own enthusiasm must have mirrored Margaret's. He pulled her even closer, practically onto his lap. Margaret's whole body shuddered at the contact. "Edward," she breathed. Edward growled in response, and he moved his lips to her neck, pressing hot kisses downward, all the way to her collarbone. He sucked lightly at the tender skin at the base of her throat. Margaret gasped, so taken by the new sensations shuddering through her body. She'd never felt like this before, never imagined it could be like this. "Wait," she managed, lips barely able to formulate the words. "Edward, wait." Edward pulled back immediately, face flushed and pupils blown wide. He regarded her with quiet intensity. "Margaret, I must apologize. That was, I don't know what." "Speak, speak, you lovesick fool." "It's all right," said Edward softly, touching his fingertips to her cheek. He pulled her face back so that she couldn't hide her eyes. "You did nothing wrong." "It was not ladylike." Edward shook his head. "You are the greatest of ladies I have ever had the pleasure of being acquainted with." "Is that what we are to one another?" "Acquainted?" Edward pulled back, just slightly, shocked. "Margaret, to me we are much more than that." When she didn't respond, he went on, more and more passion working its way into his voice with each word. "I find myself wishing we were together at all hours of the day. I wake up, and your smile is the first thing I think of. I go to sleep, and I dream of the conversations we've shared throughout the day. Whenever I open a book, I always wonder, what would Margaret think of this passage, or that line of phrasing?" Margaret's whole body felt warm, not just from arousal. She felt as though there was a small, steady blaze burning in her chest, like hot coals heating a cold room. My lord. You are my happiness. Edward leaned forward, pressing a final kiss to the corner of her lips. So, please, there is no need to doubt yourself around me. Margaret could still feel the ghost of his lips on hers. Her skin tingled where he'd explored down her neck. Blushing, she whispered, "Then I won't." Edward's eyes brightened. His fingers grazed her chin, and taking the cue for what it was, Margaret nodded her permission. The Marquess brought their lips together once more. Chapter 16. They didn't carry on as they were for much longer. This thing between them, while fiery and passionate and not entirely within their control, was still new. Still in many ways vulnerable. It's worth it to tread lightly, Edward thought to himself, as they straightened their clothes and put the study back in order. He watched out of the corner of his eye as Margaret picked up too many books, only to drop about half of them, her hands shaking. Edward felt much the same. Here, he said, lowering himself to the ground to help her pick them up. Allow me. Margaret, cheeks pink, backed away. My apologies. You have nothing to apologize for. In fact, I quite like knowing it's possible to have such an effect on you. Margaret's blush deepened. She was so lovely, so pure of heart, always wishing the best for those around her. Edward, caught in the throes of an intense wave of affection, couldn't help but reflect on how different these past weeks would have been without knowing her. Father's decline in health would have been much harder to bear. And Rebecca. She would have suffered much worse after the loss of Dorothy. Edward's thoughts regarding his father's health must have sent some version of a signal out to the powers that be. Minutes later, as he escorted a quiet and still pink-faced Margaret to her quarters, Ruby hustled around the corner frantic. My lord, it's your father. His condition has taken a drastic turn for the worse. Margaret looked at Edward, alarmed. It took Edward a moment to tear his thoughts away from Margaret and the lovely time they had just shared. He stepped forward. I'll go to him at once. The physician was called despite the late hour, for father's health had indeed plummeted significantly. He tossed and turned, consumed by a high fever, eyes clamped tight with each wet cough that racked his body. I fear he may not recover, the physician said gravely some time later, addressing both Edward and Margaret. It would be wise to begin getting his affairs in order. Margaret had insisted on staying despite Edward's urging that she ought to go on and get some sleep, arguing that someone needed to keep the Duke's temperature down while the physician was fetched. Now her face paled. Surely there's still a chance. The physician sighed and began cleaning his spectacles with a handkerchief. A chance, yes, but not a good one. Margaret's shoulders drooped. Her face pinched together, and she looked sharply away as if fighting tears. Edward moved. Chapter 16. They didn't carry on as they were for much longer. This thing between them, while fiery and passionate and not entirely within their control, was still new. Still in many ways vulnerable. It's worth it to tread lightly, Edward thought to himself, as they straightened their clothes and put the study back in order. He watched out of the corner of his eye as Margaret picked up too many books, only to drop about half of them, her hands shaking. Edward felt much the same. Here, he said, lowering himself to the ground to help her pick them up. Allow me. Margaret, cheeks pink, backed away. My apologies. You have nothing to apologize for. In fact, I quite like knowing it's possible to have such an effect on you. Margaret's blush deepened. She was so lovely, so pure of heart, always wishing the best for those around her. Edward, caught in the throes of an intense wave of affection, couldn't help but reflect on how different these past weeks would have been without knowing her. Father's decline in health would have been much harder to bear. And Rebecca. She would have suffered much worse after the loss of Dorothy. Edward's thoughts regarding his father's health must have sent some version of a signal out to the powers that be. Minutes later, as he escorted a quiet and still pink-faced Margaret to her quarters, Ruby hustled around the corner frantic. "My lord, it's your father. His condition has taken a drastic turn for the worse." Margaret looked at Edward, alarmed. It took Edward a moment to tear his thoughts away from Margaret and the lovely time they had just shared. He stepped forward. "I'll go to him at once." The physician was called despite the late hour, for father's health had indeed plummeted significantly. He tossed and turned, consumed by a high fever, eyes clamped tight with each wet cough that racked his body. "I fear he may not recover," the physician said gravely some time later, addressing both Edward and Margaret. "It would be wise to begin getting his affairs in order." Margaret had insisted on staying despite Edward's urging that she ought to go on and get some sleep, arguing that someone needed to keep the Duke's temperature down while the physician was fetched. Now her face paled. "Surely there's still a chance." The physician sighed and began cleaning his spectacles with a handkerchief. A chance, yes, but not a good one. Margaret's shoulders drooped. Her face pinched together, and she looked sharply away as if fighting tears. Edward, moving without consciously making the decision to do so, put an arm around her. The physician lifted his eyebrows in surprise. Edward stared back at him blankly. His insides felt curiously, disturbingly empty. Of course, this was the moment Robert decided to finally grace them with his presence, after yet another night out on the town. "What's all this, then?" he demanded, staggering through the door, words running together. Edward turned to his brother. Voice flat, he said, "You were sent for hours ago. Had you not been out involving yourself with debauchery, perhaps you would already be aware." Chapter 17. The next morning, Margaret rose early to check in on the Duke. Ruby stopped her at the door. "I'm sorry, Miss Andrews," she said, averting her eyes, "but Lord Robert has specifically requested that you refrain from visiting the Duke." "Did he say why?" Margaret asked, frustrated and alarmed. Ruby shook her head. She angled her body away from Margaret as though she very much wanted to leave. "I'm sure he's just concerned for his father's rest." With that, Ruby hustled away, leaving Margaret alone in the dark hall. Of course Robert would do something like this, thought Margaret as she made her way down to breakfast. He's obviously intimidated Ruby into doing his bidding over the matter as well. Margaret continued to stew all through her meal and even into her regular lessons with Rebecca. She didn't realise she'd been acting so distant until Rebecca set down her writing utensil and said, "Miss Andrews, are you all right?" Margaret's mind lurched back into the present. The room was dim today, taking on an overall grey tint due to the clouds that had gathered into an impenetrable grim ceiling outside. It seemed a fitting environment for the way she was feeling after last night's devastating news. But her feelings weren't the priority at the moment. Upon looking into Rebecca's wide, fretful eyes, Margaret understood that the little girl had a greater sense of what was going on than she'd previously revealed. "I'm all right, my dear," said Margaret. "A little shaken, I will admit. But how are you?" Rebecca looked away, staring hard at the text they'd been half-heartedly going over together mere moments before. She picked at the corner of the page, bending it back and forth until a worn line appeared. "Be gentle, please," Margaret said quietly, stilling Rebecca's fidgeting hand with her own. Rebecca's face pinched and her lip quivered. "I'm sorry." Margaret hardly had time to process this downward shift of emotions before Rebecca started crying. Not loudly. No, if anything, the quiet way the tears tracked down the little girl's face and the way she stifled her sobs in her throat was all too telling. Here was a child who had long learned how to cry in secret. "Shh, shh, my dear girl," said Margaret, pulling Rebecca into her arms. "It's all right." Rebecca resisted at first, But the attempt didn't last. She flung herself at Margaret and at last sobbed openly into her shoulder. "Father is really going to die, isn't he?" she said, voice muffled by the fabric of Margaret's dress. "They don't know that for certain," said Margaret, rubbing a hand in gentle circles between the little girl's shoulder blades. Rebecca sniffled, taking this in. She seemed a bit calmer now, having let some of the emotion out in the arms of someone safe. Quietly she added, "If he does, Edward thinks Robert might make us leave." Margaret stiffened. Rebecca pulled back. She looked Margaret in the eye, red-rimmed gaze sharp. "It's true, isn't it? Robert will make Edward and me go somewhere else. Robert's always said he would, and Edward always told me before that he was jesting. But this morning, when Edward told me what happened last night with Father..." Margaret had to cut in before Rebecca jumped to even worse conclusions. "Surely Edward didn't outright tell you that Robert expects you to leave if something happens to the Duke?" "Well," said Rebecca, stopping to chew on her bottom lip as she thought, "I suppose he didn't say that exactly, but he did not deny it either." Margaret sighed. Rebecca was often too observant for her own good, or at least her own peace of mind. Edward never would have outright told his little sister that their father was dying and they were liable to be thrown out onto the street within the same breath. Even so, Margaret wouldn't put it past Robert, and she doubted Edward would either. Whether he'd intended to make Rebecca fully aware of the stakes they faced or not, Rebecca had put two and two together on her own. "Then it sounds like we don't know anything for certain," Margaret said seriously, looking Rebecca directly in the eye as she would an adult. She reached past the little girl with one hand and pulled Rebecca's chair back out for her. "The best thing we can do right now, then, is keep on as we have and try to think positively." Rebecca gave a small nod and returned to her seat. "All right, Miss Andrews." She pressed her thumb against the corner of the page she'd been fidgeting with, smoothing out the crease. "Whatever happens, I know Edward will make it all right in the end." Yes, Margaret thought, as memories of last night's kiss took hold for the first time since receiving the awful news about the Duke. "I do believe he will." They stayed on course for the remainder of their lesson, and ultimately Rebecca was quite productive. By the end, however, Margaret found herself so intellectually and emotionally spent, she opted to forego dinner and return to her quarters early. She'd been up so late last night, an early retirement this evening could only do her good. She'd also been thinking of the way Ruby had, or hadn't, looked at her this morning in the hall, as well as the way that the physician had turned his eyes away last night upon witnessing Edward pull Margaret close. Regardless of His Grace's situation, if you're not more careful, people are going to talk, Margaret told herself, slipping under the covers. It was a weak, anxiety-driven command. The sun had hardly set, and already she could barely keep her eyes open, much less sort out all of her complicated feelings over the situation with Edward. A knock came on the door. "Miss Andrews?" It was Ruby's voice, undeniably hesitant. "Lord Edward wishes to see you." Margaret's pulse picked up slightly at the thought of seeing Edward even now. But she was tired. So much had happened over the last day. Surely she could wait a while and let her thoughts settle before moving forward one way or the other. Margaret rose from the bed and opened the door a crack. "I am unfortunately feeling unwell. If you could please convey my apologies to the Marquess." Ruby nodded slowly, a silent communication passing between them. She regarded Margaret with warm sympathy. "Very well, Miss Andrews. I'm sure Lord Edward will be pleased to know you are keeping your own good health in mind." Margaret nodded, relieved, and reached to shut the door. Before she could, Ruby added, "The younger Marquess cares a great deal for you, after all. I do hope you shepherd that knowledge wisely." Margaret blinked back her surprise. By the time she recovered enough to respond, Ruby was already gone. Chapter 18. Rebecca was silent all through dinner, and Robert didn't turn up at all. Upon finishing his meal, Edward attempted to send for Margaret, only to be disappointed when Ruby brought word that she was feeling under the weather and had retired to bed early. "That's quite all right," Edward said, even though it wasn't. Well, it was. He didn't want Margaret forgoing rest on his account, especially given everything that had unfolded last night. "I'll just miss her." "Thank you, Ruby." Resigned to a depressing evening alone with all sorts of stresses simmering under the surface, Edward shut himself away in his study. Now that most of his evenings were spent reading in Margaret's company, it had been a while since he'd sat and read silently to himself. He tried to lose himself in the page and remember what he'd once liked so much about solitude. Of course, Robert had to let himself in and spoil his attempt. He stood in the threshold for a long moment, regarding Edward coolly. At last, Edward acknowledged him with a flat, "What?" We're in a testy mood tonight, aren't we? Considering our father lies dying in his bedchamber, and you've been out all day stirring up trouble while I've barely been managing here. Yes, brother, I do believe it's safe to say I'm not in the grandest mood." Very well, very well." Robert sauntered into the room in a proper motion and ran a hand over the thick spines of the books lining the shelves. "I won't interrupt your dramatic moping for long. I merely came to inform you that the game is up." "Game?" "Yes, game." Robert stopped right in front of Edward's chair, suddenly looming over him. "I know all about how you and that conniving little oyster cook are conspiring to steal my rightful status as father's heir. As your loving brother, I thought it my duty to warn you against so foolishly wasting your time." It took Edward a moment to process what Robert was saying, then another moment still to work through the absurdity of it all. Instead of lashing out, as was Edward's first inclination, he gritted his teeth and returned his eyes to his book. "Robert, I have no interest in the estate. Why would I, when you've gone to such lengths to make all my memories of this place so vile?" Robert didn't respond immediately, but Edward could feel his brother's sharp eyes on the back of his neck. "Vile?" Robert said at last. "You, ungrateful excuse of a Marquess. Your lucky father hasn't disowned you altogether, what with your one leg and now bad reputation." Edward looked up, questioning, before he could think twice about it. "Ah, yes, your reputation. How sad to see it so unnecessarily tarnished," said Robert gleefully, beginning to pace again. "What are you talking about, Robert?" "While it's true, no one has let the news slip yet. Realistically, it's only a matter of time." Robert. "Truly, dear brother?" said Robert, turning to look at him at last, a wide, cruel smile stretching his cheeks. "Courting a wench? People in London will have a blast with this." He shook his head, faux remorseful. "When the news does get out, I suppose we can only hope it won't affect the reputation of that oyster bar she used to work at as well." Edward sat there, frozen. Robert regarded him, one brow lifted, smiling. Always forever smiling. He truly takes pleasure in all of this, doesn't he? A heavy weight came over Edward as his reality clarified. His brother, his twin, who he'd come into this world and shared a life with these first 22 years, could feel no real love, no real compassion. At turns, Robert was consumed by ugly joy at the expense of others, and paranoia that even those who professed to love him would turn right around and do the same. "It doesn't have to be like this," Edward croaked. Robert must have thought Edward was only referring to the threat against Margaret. "I'm afraid it does, unless for all the times you've declared yourself the greater gentleman, you finally decide to take responsibility and act the part." Edward didn't want to accommodate Robert's threats. It was a slippery slope that could only end in diminished self-respect and overall devastation. But Robert wouldn't just spread rumours of Edward and Margaret courting. No, he would make the proclamation as ugly and inappropriate as possible, at the very least calling it an affair. With Edward's birth status, he would eventually recover. But Margaret, her prospects for future employment and marriage would be severely diminished, if not destroyed altogether. Edward closed his book and stared down at his lap, fighting back tears of powerlessness and rage. What exactly would you have me do? Chapter 19. Margaret felt much more rested the next day. Truly, a good night's sleep could make all the difference when it came to having the proper energy for facing one's problems. Yes, she was still frightfully worried about his Grace, and what would become of the household should Robert become the next Duke. But it was also a fine day outside. She would have the pleasure of spending an afternoon tutoring a bright young pupil, and in the evening, Edward and these new feelings blossoming between them awaited. It was safe to say Margaret had lived through much worse days. As such, she went about her morning in relatively bright spirits, savouring her breakfast and taking care to appreciate each and every moment with Rebecca. It wasn't until later that evening, when Margaret found herself waiting alone for Edward by the stairs, that she thought to consider anything might be wrong. Well, more wrong than was already the case, given the Duke's condition. "Excuse me, Ruby," Margaret asked, catching the maid in the hall close to the staff quarters. "Have you seen the younger Marquess?" "Why?" Ruby asked, a note of suspicion in her voice. Margaret had begun to feel off her footing around Ruby. It seemed the maid had some inkling of what was going on between her and Edward, but from her reactions it felt impossible to judge whether Ruby was an ally or adversary in the situation. It made sense that someone like Ruby, who had served the household for years, wouldn't approve of a Marquess pursuing anything romantic with a governess, and a new governess at that. Even so. "Ruby and I are friends, aren't we?" "It's just that I haven't seen him all day," Margaret said. As a precaution, she added their standard excuse. "I was hoping to update him on young Lady Rebecca's progress." Ruby gave her a sceptical look, and Margaret couldn't blame her. She did update Lord Edward on the young Lady Rebecca's progress, on a seemingly constant basis. Not to mention it likely came across as a bit suspicious, the way Margaret gave daily updates to the Duke and Edward. Or at least it had been, when his Grace was still conscious regularly enough for Margaret's visits to serve a purpose. "He's in his study," Ruby said at last, face unreadable. "He requested all of his meals be brought to him there today." "Thank you, Ruby, I do appreciate it." Margaret tried to lend as much sincerity to her voice as possible. Perhaps if Ruby could sense the depth of her gratitude, she would warm up to Margaret again. But Ruby just nodded and went on her way. Margaret sighed, but picked herself up nonetheless. In mere minutes, she and Edward would be alone together once more. Except when Margaret knocked on the study door, no one answered. She knocked again. Finally, she tried the handle, only to find it locked. "My lord," Margaret called softly. "It's me." Edward, as it turns out, was in the study after all. He responded, "I would prefer to be alone right now, thank you." The coldness in his voice made Margaret's skin go clammy. "Have I offended you in any way, my lord?" "I don't want to talk now. Good night." "Edward." "Leave, Margaret." Margaret stepped back from the door. She'd never heard Edward speak so harshly. A horrible thought came to her. Then, as she stood alone in the hall, feeling her throat tightening, Edward thought less of her for going further with their kiss. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, unable to keep the hurt and anger from tinting her words. "I didn't realise I was talking to the wrong twin." She fled before Edward could respond or come after her. "No, never mind that. He isn't going to come after me. He doesn't want to see me at all." It wasn't until later, after she'd spent far too long crying alone into her pillows, that Margaret's sense of reason returned. Edward was about to lose his father. Yes, there was bad blood between them. But Margaret's relationship with her own father had been far from perfect, and she'd still mourned deeply. "He's grieving in his own way," she told herself. "Leave him be for now. Draw your conclusions tomorrow." Margaret could only hope she wasn't latching onto the first convenient explanation that presented itself. Chapter 20. Edward hardly slept at all that night. He felt terrible for speaking to Margaret so rudely. He felt even worse for doing it through a closed door like a coward. What was he to do going forward? It wasn't as if he could just avoid Margaret forever. And even so, he didn't want to. He wished he could come up with a better solution. It will be better for Margaret like this, Edward thought in the general nebulous direction of his dark ceiling. She deserves someone better than me anyway, someone who can love her and protect her, who won't put her reputation at risk. She could never love him the way he loved her, after all. Margaret was whole, pure, kind. Edward was broken, and not just because of his leg. The only one who could love him as he was, it seemed, was Rebecca, and even that love was tainted in its own way. For if Rebecca had grown up with a mother, she wouldn't have felt half as strongly as she did for an older brother. And whose fault was it that Mother was lost to them all forever? If Mother were here, she'd know what to do, if you hadn't let her die. Edward took a shaky breath and made himself sit up. He lit the candle at his bedside and cracked open his book. He couldn't let his thoughts continue to move in this direction, but he couldn't focus on the words either. There would be no respite from this fresh agony. The next day, Edward took his meals in his study again. The day after that as well. It wasn't until the third day that Margaret made another attempt to speak with him, knocking lightly on the door and calling, "My lord, I understand you're in pain. I do." Then, when he didn't answer, continuing, "When I lost my own father, I could hardly even eat for weeks. I didn't want to see or speak to anyone, not even those I was closest to. All I could do to cope was throw myself into looking for work and disappearing into the sanctuary of my books. It wasn't until I met you that I—" "Do quit prattling on," Edward said, unable to bear it any longer. It was cruel of him, he knew it was cruel of him, but it was what Robert would say, and if he had to act like Robert to create a clean break, then that is what he would do. As expected, Margaret went silent. Light footsteps hurried away from the door. Edward felt as though all his insides had been carved up with a sharp knife. As soon as he was certain Margaret was truly gone, he doubled over, clutching his stomach, certain he would be sick. He almost wished he would be sick, if only to get rid of the awful sensation of ugly, churning emotions. Nothing came up. Margaret did not come back. The only times Edward left his study at all over the course of a week were for sleep, or to visit his father, who continued to slip in and out of consciousness, muttering things unintelligible to all but the most trained ears. When Edward heard his father muttering his mother's name, he decided enough was enough. "I have to get out of this house." Once he'd made the decision, he executed it swiftly, making himself presentable enough to leave in mere minutes, moving as though he were escaping pursuit by the constables rather than simply going out for a stroll in the park. He was out of his room and halfway down the stairs when he heard voices by the door. "Well, hello, Miss Andrews," came the voice of William Beauchamp. "I knew from Lord Robert that you had come to work at Lockwood Manor, but who would have thought the position would suit you so well?" Edward froze. His hand tightened around the banister. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Margaret said tonelessly. "If you're looking for the elder Marquess, I believe he's already gone out for the day." Before the conversation could continue any further, Edward made himself move forward. Both Margaret and Lord Beauchamp lurched into silence upon his appearance. Margaret's face clouded, and she looked sharply at the floor. "If you'll excuse me," she said, brushing past Edward and heading up the stairs herself. Lord Beauchamp looked at Edward with raised eyebrows. Edward absolutely didn't need the judgment of Robert's imbecile friend weighing him down as well. He shouldered his way past and exited onto the bustling London streets. By the time he made it to Hyde Park itself, Edward's leg was causing him a fair deal of discomfort. People kept giving him odd looks, and at first he was certain it was because of his uneven gait. He'd been in such a rush to leave. He hadn't taken care to modify his walk so that fellow pedestrians wouldn't pick up on his prosthetic. It wasn't until he passed a young boy looking down at him from atop a carriage that Edward realised he was crying. How could you have allowed your life to turn out like this? He couldn't do right by Margaret. He couldn't do right by Rebecca, who was just as likely to be thrown out onto the street alongside him upon father's death. He certainly hadn't done right by mother. "It should have been you," Edward said under his breath, relishing the sweet condemnation of the words. "It should have been you that night, not her. Everyone you love would have been better off by far." Chapter 21. After Edward brushed by her so rudely on his way out to some unknown destination, it had taken Margaret some time to regather herself. Again. "Do not think of him," she reminded herself, walking swiftly and with cultivated purpose back to the room where she and Rebecca were set up for their lessons. "Think of Rebecca. Think of the work you're doing. This was your goal in the first place, to be a governess. But it was so difficult, having fallen so hard, only to have those affections turned against her so viciously. And for what? Because she had taken their kiss further. Given into her passion, when Edward had said in the very moment that he felt the same, and that she shouldn't doubt herself. Everything had been going so well. Thankfully, things with Rebecca continued in a positive trajectory. Margaret threw herself into her work, spending more and more time with the little girl, going on walks, singing songs, and practicing the pianoforte in addition to their usual studies. "Did your mother teach you how to play?" Rebecca asked, her short legs dangling from the high bench. "Well, no," Margaret said. "The wife of the gentleman I used to work for at the Royal Lion taught me. I'm honestly fairly new to the instrument myself by most standards." Rebecca picked out the little tune they'd been practicing for the last bit. "I'm glad you're the one teaching me." Margaret smiled. For all the things that had been difficult lately, Rebecca truly did remain a light in the darkness. And I, as well. Robert, however, continued to be vile and insulting whenever their paths crossed, which was more often now, given that the Duke's time seemed so short. Yes, Robert still went out at odd hours throughout the night, but he spent more time at the manor itself than he had in months. Margaret took great care to tread carefully. Now that Edward was no longer escorting her to her quarters each evening, she didn't dare run the risk of once again getting caught alone by the elder Marquess. One day, however, when Margaret's studies with Rebecca concluded for the afternoon, she received an unexpected summons. "His Grace wishes to speak with you," Ruby announced from the doorway. Margaret stood up, confused but hopeful. "I thought I was forbidden from visiting him." Ruby fixed her eyes on something beyond Margaret's shoulder, as if it was taking her great effort to keep her face impassive. Even so, a smile threatened at the edge of her lips. "His lordship is out on an errand this afternoon." Margaret didn't waste any further time. It had been over a week now since the physician's dire proclamation, and there had been at least 3 nights now when it seemed as though the Duke was hovering on the brink of passing on. Somehow, he had managed to keep his hold on life, but who knew how much longer that would last? Margaret quite missed their conversations. "My dear Miss Andrews," the Duke wheezed. He was lying in bed, too weak now to even sit up. Each word sounded as though it pained him greatly. "How have you fared this past week?" Oddly, Margaret suddenly found herself missing Rupert and Nick quite deeply. She wished more than anything she had someone to confide in right now, to share her pain over Edward with. His father, who also happened to be the Duke of Somerset, was far from the correct person to meet that need. "It's been a painful time, Your Grace." Margaret could admit that much honestly. The Duke's eyes opened and closed slowly. "It needn't be, not for you." He reached out a shaking hand. Margaret knelt at his bedside and gripped it in her own. Despite his weak voice, the Duke spoke with such conviction, Margaret couldn't help but fight tears. "Miss Andrews, you have been a blessing to this household. The regard you hold for my daughter. It brings me great joy to know that she will be stewarded forward in life by such a young lady with such spirit and integrity."
Before we continue into the story, do us a favor. Like this video and hit the subscribe button because it helps very much with YouTube's algorithm. If you want the audiobooks ads free, visit our website and select our bundles to save more. Thank you again. Now back to our story.
Thank you, Your Grace. Yes. The Duke's eyes closed again and stayed that way. His words slurred together as he disappeared once more into sleep. I do believe you have a beautiful life ahead of you. It didn't feel that way to Margaret. If anything, she felt as if her life were already over. She released the Duke's hand and wiped away the single tear that had trailed its way down her cheek. In the distance, a bell tolled. Robert would undoubtedly be back soon. Margaret knew it would be in her best interest not to be caught again at the Duke's bedside. Of course, the moment she stepped into the hall, she ran right into Edward. He seemed just as shocked to see her, at least at first. But then his face tightened, turning into this awful guarded thing that Margaret felt was completely foreign from the man she thought she'd fallen for. I suggest you don't disobey Robert's orders, he said, voice flat, when Margaret failed to find her tongue and speak first. Not if you want to avoid trouble once he's lord of the manor. Without another word, Edward turned his back to her and entered his father's quarters. Margaret didn't stay to tell him the Duke had just now fallen asleep. Instead, she returned to her quarters and at last succumbed to the tears she'd been fighting for days. Chapter 22. For the first time in over a week, Edward made himself go down to the dining hall for dinner instead of taking it in his study. He was not expecting the table to be filled by Robert and his horde of debaucherous friends. "Where's Rebecca?" Edward asked, his voice barely audible over the loud and raucous conversation. "That little brat has no place here," said Robert after downing a deep gulp of wine. "You're really so naive as to want her around all this?" Robert gestured wildly. Several of his friends laughed in that big-bellied, drunken way of theirs. Edward was willing to bet they had been out on the town at some inn or another getting an early start before bringing their foolery back here. "Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" Edward couldn't help but demand. "Our father is dying upstairs." "Dying is the key word, not dead," said Robert a little more calmly. No, not calm. Mocking. "I doubt he will leave us tonight, brother." He nodded at his comrades. "I would ask you to join, but, this is a private party, you see, and no cripples were invited." Edward sighed and turned on his heel. He could find no purpose in staying and continuing to endure his brother's rudeness. On his way out, Robert called after him, "I'll make a note to do so next time, though." Edward returned to his study, locking the door tight. If only he could lock the sounds of their laughter from his memory as well. "At least I still have my books," he thought, picking up the Dante he'd been reading earlier and returning to his chair. Moments later, a small, timid knock came on the door. Edward almost told whoever it was to leave him be. Thankfully, he held off long enough for the other party to speak first, because it turned out to be Rebecca. "Edward," she called through the thick wood. "Would you please let me in?" He rose and went to the door. When he opened it, there stood his little sister, a weariness that came only with age or grief twisting her young features. "My dear girl," Edward said, crouching low to speak to her more directly. "What's the matter?" "You haven't been at any of the meals lately," Rebecca said, fiddling with her skirt. "And you haven't been reading to me. I've been having a pleasant time with Miss Andrews. A very pleasant time." She met his eyes, pleading. "I just thought maybe we could spend a little time together too, you and me." Edward felt as though a fist was closing around his heart. He hadn't been attending to Rebecca like he should have been this past week at all. For all he was hurting over Margaret, Rebecca was soon to lose the only parent she'd ever known. Not to mention, Robert had apparently been taking over the dining room for who knows how many meals. "Come here," Edward said, pulling Rebecca into a hug. "Yes, we can absolutely spend some time together. I'm sorry I've been so distant lately. I will do better." Rebecca pulled away and regarded him with some of her usual brightness returned. "Then surely you'll agree to join Miss Andrews and me on a picnic tomorrow." Chapter 23. Margaret thought Rebecca's insistence that the two of them go on a picnic together was a splendid way to get out of the house and create a little distance from the grim tension that had overtaken them all. She rose early and went to the kitchen, where she hummed as she prepared a basket of scones, fruit and jam for their outing. Sunshine came through the dirty little window that looked out on the back steps. Margaret found herself enjoying the fulfillment that came with preparing a meal, even one as simple as this. Especially since it was early enough, Robert wouldn't be awake to catch her alone and cause an issue. When the time came for her and Rebecca to depart, however, Rebecca stopped Margaret at the door. "Wait," she said, and tugged on Margaret's dress. "Is something the matter?" Margaret asked, hoping she didn't sound too impatient. She wanted to leave the house as quickly as possible, to avoid running into those she particularly didn't want to see. Edward might have confined himself to his study, but it would be a lie to say Margaret hadn't done much the same with her own quarters and the room where she tutored Rebecca. "No," said Rebecca, glancing up at the stairs. "Just wait." Margaret waited. She waited for 2 minutes, then 5, then 10. Every time she tried to gently insist that they ought to get going if they were to beat the heat of the afternoon, Rebecca asked for 1 more minute, just 1. "What is this important surprise?" Margaret finally asked, putting full insistence into her tone. She assumed Rebecca had bothered the regular kitchen staff on their behalf and had perhaps requested her own menu items to be added to their basket at the last minute. Margaret could not have been more wrong. Shoulders slumping in defeat, Rebecca admitted the truth. "I invited Edward to come with us. Last night he said he would. He even promised he would. But I guess he got busy." Margaret looked back up the stairs towards where she knew Edward to be locked away in his study, getting up to who knows what. A slow, burning rage overtook her. How dare he treat Rebecca like this? To think I ever thought him kind at all. "You're probably right, and I'm sure he means nothing by it." Margaret struggled to keep the anger out of her voice as she physically steered Rebecca towards the door. "Nevertheless, the two of us will still be sure to have a lovely time." It wasn't a lovely time. It was fine, certainly. Nothing else went catastrophically wrong. But Rebecca was subdued the entire time, barely picking at her food. When they finally left the park and headed for home, Margaret wasn't sure their spirits weren't even lower than they had been before. Chapter 24. Edward did not get up that morning. He remembered Rebecca's words the night before, insisting they all go on a picnic together. But the thought of facing Margaret again, or more importantly putting her reputation at risk by engaging with one another so publicly, was too daunting to face. He simply couldn't make himself get up to go. Instead, he lay in bed, stared at the ceiling, and waved away Ruby when she offered to bring him breakfast directly. Perhaps if he lay here long enough he would starve, and that could be that. It would save Robert the trouble of getting rid of him some other way. Yet as the day wore on, Edward's stomach and feelings of boredom ultimately got the best of him. He made himself rise and dress. "I'll just slip down to the kitchen to request some food. I won't make myself speak to anyone other than the cook. It won't be so hard." But as Edward was getting dressed, he lost his balance and fell at an odd angle. That blasted prosthetic, causing him struggles again. It was at that very moment Ruby returned to knock on the door and announce gravely, "My lord, it's your father. They say he will not make it through the night." At this point, Edward had been summoned 4 separate times under the notion that the Duke was doubtful to make it through the night. The fact that this new announcement was coming as he sat half-dressed and one-legged on the floor in the middle of late afternoon made Edward want to laugh and scream at the same time. With as much propriety as he could muster, he said, "Thank you, Ruby. Shall Shall I tell them you'll be there shortly? Yes, thank you. After an awkward silence, Ruby nodded and left. Edward sat on the floor and stared at his leg. No, not his leg. It wasn't anyone's leg. It was a fake, ridiculous hunk of wood. And the idea that it could be anything else or replace what had been lost was ridiculous. How had he laboured under any other belief for so long? Perhaps Robert was right. Perhaps Edward was naive. In a fit of unexpected rage, Edward picked up the prosthetic and threw it clear across the room. It bounced off the wall above his headboard and landed atop his unmade bed. No one came running. The house was quiet. Except, the house wasn't quiet, was it? Down the hall, muted by several walls worth of wood and plaster, someone was screaming. Chapter 25. Margaret, on her own way back to her room after dinner, caught sight of a distressed Ruby in the hall. "Ruby, you look as though you've had a fright," Margaret said, stopping the woman in hopes of helping her calm down. "Not a fright," Ruby said, shaking her head. "It's His Grace. It really seems as though he's going this time." Margaret looked past Ruby towards the Duke's room. "Have you shared this with the young lords yet?" "No, not yet," said Ruby. She looked distastefully towards the stairs. Hearty, overbearing laughter rose up from the ground floor. "I've been instructed to tell Lord Robert's guests that they must depart early. It's not a task I'm looking forward to." It was as honest as Ruby had ever been regarding her opinion of Robert. Margaret nearly hugged her. She was so grateful to have someone speak frankly in commiseration. "Do you think, then," Margaret began, holding off on the hug, but nodding in the direction of the Duke's quarters. Ruby followed her gaze. She nodded conspiratorially, tears shining in her eyes. "Go. Who is to say how much time he has left?" Margaret didn't wait to be told twice. She went immediately to the Duke's bedside. The man seemed to have aged decades since she'd seen him last, just days ago. His eyes were open as mere slits, his pupils wheeling within. For a long while, Margaret just knelt there beside him, clutching his hand. Downstairs, she could hear quite a bit of commotion, likely Ruby telling Robert that the Duke had ordered the guests to be dismissed. But she paid it little mind. "I know I haven't known you long, Your Grace," Margaret said, speaking aloud despite her doubts that the Duke was conscious enough to hear her. "But thank you for welcoming me to your home. Whatever the situation has become between the Marquesses and myself, I am so grateful to have shared in this opportunity, even for just a short while." She did not know what she would do once the Duke was gone, and Robert was head of the household in his place. She didn't know what awaited her or Rebecca at all. Margaret was so caught up in her thoughts she did not sense the glowering presence hovering over her until it was too late. "Well then," drawled Robert's low, cruel voice, "it seems you're quite terrible at following orders after all." Margaret jolted to her feet. But Robert didn't waste any time in backing her up against the wall, pressing his body closer and closer until there was hardly any space between them at all. "I'll scream," she threatened. Her words came out with no more power than a hoarse whisper. Robert just grinned. "Scream all you like. Within minutes the estate and title will be mine, and then what I say goes." He leaned in close, so that his lips just brushed beneath her ear. "No one is going to come running, not for you." Margaret tried to push him off of her. As a last resort at any sort of reason, not that Robert seemed to operate within reason at the best of times, she said, "Your father is dying 2 feet away. How can you behave this way?" She didn't realize she was crying until she heard the wetness in her throat. The recognition didn't last long. Robert moved swiftly, suddenly, and full-on pinned her against the wall. Margaret made good on her promise. She screamed. Chapter 26. Edward's breath hitched. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. His brother, that absolute brute, pressing a screaming Margaret against the wall, feet away from their father's deathbed. Moving without thinking about it, Edward strode quickly across the room. He forgot he was wearing a prosthetic. He forgot he walked with a limp. He forgot about titles and inheritance and propriety and even his mother. The only thing in Edward's mind in that moment was that he had to protect the woman he loved. The past was gone, and there was no changing it. All that mattered was the decisions he made now. "Get off of her!" he bellowed, grabbing Robert's shoulders from behind and flinging him onto the ground. The room went silent, save Margaret's panicked, tearful hyperventilating. Robert stared up at him from the floor, his lip bloodied. He must have bitten it in the fall. "A bit of a reversal for you there, brother," said Edward, glaring down at his despicable twin. "Who's the one without a leg to stand on now?" Slowly, furiously, Robert rose up again. Margaret crowded in close behind Edward, pressing herself against his back and clinging, tight, to his arm. Edward pushed the irrational joy that threatened to ignite at their returned closeness from his consciousness. He widened his stance and braced himself for his brother's retaliation. It was not to come. Just as Robert moved towards him, Ruby, having returned with Rebecca and several other members of the senior staff, gasped from the doorway. The audience caught Robert's attention before he could attack again. Almost comically, he stumbled over his feet and had to brace himself on the wall again to avoid a second hard fall within a minute's time. "Ruby, please," said Margaret, speaking clearly for the first time since Edward's arrival, despite her tears. "Rebecca should not see this." Ruby nodded fiercely and hurriedly shuffled the stunned little girl out of the room. Robert, at last, seemed to have regained some semblance of personhood. He straightened himself and his clothes, while regarding the staff of Lockwood Manor with entitled petulance. "Well, what are you all staring at? Don't you have work to do?" "The Duke is not expected to last the night," said one of the senior staff members, stepping forward a bit awkwardly, like he wasn't sure whether or not it was his place to do so. "The staff has come to pay their respects." "Pay your respect to me, then," said Robert. "As the new Duke of Somerset, I say you have no business lingering in this space any longer." "You are not to be Duke of Somerset," came a low voice. Robert whipped around, glaring at Edward. "What was that?" "I said nothing," Edward replied. He nodded down at Father's bed. He did. Indeed, Father had regained consciousness at some point during all the commotion. He'd pushed himself into as much of a sitting position as he could manage. It set off another coughing fit, and Margaret lowered herself to help him through it. Edward looked away at the sight of the blood on Father's handkerchief, a strange knot in his chest. "Surely you didn't say what I thought you said," Robert warned, once Father had regained his composure. Father, the Duke of Somerset, straightened himself, regarded his eldest son in front of their entire senior staff and said, "My worst fears have been realized. Robert, through such brutish, undignified action, you have proven yourself unworthy of this estate and are no son of mine." Robert balked. Edward felt as though he was sinking into the earth. Surely this couldn't really be happening. But, Father... Robert gestured weakly between Edward and Margaret. "These two are having an affair." "Leave me alone with Edward," Father said. "Father!" I said, "Leave me with Edward." It took some manoeuvring, but eventually several of the burlier staff members managed to get a hold of Robert and physically pull him from the room. There was an odd air of triumph amongst them that even Edward, in his disoriented state, picked up on. Given his constant litany of verbal and sometimes physical abuse, Robert hadn't exactly been popular among the staff. Once they were gone, Edward gave Margaret a small nod, indicating that they would speak with one another later. She reluctantly left the room as well, throwing a handful of glances over her shoulder as she went, but leaving nonetheless. Edward was alone with his father. "My son." His father patted the edge of the bed, indicating that Edward should sit down. "Yes, Father?" Edward asked, obliging. He took his father's hand in his own. I owe you an apology. Many apologies, truly. I have been a terrible father to you over the years. It was true, but Edward doubted the man's deathbed was the correct place to bring that up. He loved his father, despite the man's faults. Father, Edward began, hoping a response would come to him as he spoke, but he waved him off. Just listen, he sighed, weary, and closed his eyes. Edward almost thought he had fallen asleep, or worse, when the words began again. I loved your mother, dearly, more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. He opened his eyes and met Edward's. You're so like her, you and Rebecca both. And when we lost her, I shouldn't have blamed you. I didn't blame you. It was foolish of me and cowardly, but in truth, it was easier to be angry than to be in pain. A sudden image of a young Robert flashed across Edward's memory. The way his twin had looked at him in the days immediately following Mother's death, full of hatred and accusation. Hatred, Edward now realised, which had slowly shifted into the now familiar dark glee that had come to define his brother's demeanour. Father was still speaking. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me, but even if you can't, his words tapered off almost shyly, well, at least you will know the truth of it. Edward was at a loss for words. I thought you and Mother hated one another, he finally blurted out. I loved her, Father said, shaking his head. I did, but her heart belonged to another. She never loved me as I loved her. I was foolish to lash out so often, as though that would change anything. I hope you will not make my mistakes. Edward thought of Margaret and the way he'd treated her this past week. He'd been terrible to her, even though it had been to protect her honour. I really have no excuse for my behaviour. Edward squeezed his father's hand. I forgive you, Father. Of course I forgive you. And I will take your words to heart. Father breathed a sigh of relief. Look in the drawer then, my son. There's something there for you. Edward did as his father asked. Inside the drawer he found a legal document. Upon closer scrutiny, he saw that it was the deed to the estate. It named Edward as its heir. Father, Edward began, a million questions on his tongue. This would have taken time to prepare, meaning Father had to have been planning this for much longer than just tonight. The words died in his throat. His father was gone. It took a long while, but eventually Edward collected himself. He stood and straightened his clothes. All right, he said to himself, sad but committed. He went downstairs to where everyone seemed to have convened following the earlier upset. Robert sat dejected in the far corner, guarded by the staff members who had removed him from the room to begin with. Edward scanned the room for Margaret, but she was nowhere to be seen. Well, said one of the staff members. Edward did all he could to keep his voice level. If it was a lot to process for him, surely it was even more for the staff, who had been preparing to transition to working under Robert's impending authority. My father has passed on. In accordance with his final will and testament, I shall succeed him as the next Duke of Somerset. Edward, grim-faced, lifted the deed as evidence. Robert jumped to his feet. Now wait just a minute, Edward. What did you do? Draw that up just now in your stupid little study. It's all legal and up to order, Edward said. You can look for yourself. Oh, I plan to. I plan to right now. Robert tried to press forward, but with a nod from Edward, the staff members who'd been guarding him held him back. You know, said Edward coolly. He went to his brother and looked him dead in the eye. I think just now is the first you've called me by my actual name in years. Robert rolled his eyes and huffed, face red with rage. Is this how it is to be between us forever? Edward implored quietly, softer, words only for his brother. I keep telling you, Robert, it doesn't. We can still move forward, start over. What, so you can lord your newfound power over me? Robert spat at Edward's feet. Hardly. Edward was grateful for the numbness he felt inside. With all the staff looking on, he didn't know how he would cope if he were in touch with the full scale of his emotions. He was certain he would shed tears over the dissolution of what remained of his family later. For now, voice level, he said, "Very well then, Robert. If that is how you want it, I have no choice but to order you away." Robert's eyes jerked up, full of alarm. "You will go abroad and earn an education. I won't cut you off completely. You'll have enough money to get by in relative comfort. Even so, I would suggest you invest some serious effort into seeking out the riches of kindness." "The riches of kindness?" Robert mocked. It was a pitiful attempt to salvage a modicum of dignity. In truth, Robert looked as though he were about to cry. "Look for the good in the world," Edward said, completely serious. "It's there, Robert, I promise. And I mean it when I say I truly do hope you find a way to be happy." Edward would do anything for his brother to actually listen. Finally, though, as the staff escorted Robert back to his quarters to make sure he actually packed his things, Edward accepted the truth. No matter how much he wanted his brother to be or act a certain way, it was outside of his control, and as such beyond his responsibility. It was an oddly freeing notion. There was one thing Edward needed to accept responsibility for, however, and an important one at that. Once Robert was out of the picture, he headed upstairs to Rebecca's room. When he knocked on the door, Margaret was the one who answered, as he expected her to. It made sense that she would have gone after Rebecca to comfort her after the scene that had unfolded at father's bedside. "What is it?" Margaret asked at the door, voice shaky. "Marry me." Margaret jolted with surprise. Obviously and understandably, that wasn't what she'd been expecting. "I know I've been terrible to you lately," Edward said hastily, desperately hoping she would accept his explanation and apology. "There's no excuse for it, not really. But Robert threatened to tell the world about us. I knew I would be able to recover from it. But you have always been so kind, so virtuous. I couldn't bear it, seeing your reputation so unjustly smeared. I love you, Margaret." Margaret silenced him with a kiss. When they pulled apart with a weak smile, she said, "I knew I was right about you." "Right about me?" "You are kind and gentle and good. You're nothing like your brother. I love you too, Edward. I've loved you nearly as long as I've known you." This time it was Edward who brought their lips together. He was home, here in her arms, even if father hadn't made Edward the heir, and Robert had indeed tossed him out on the street. He knew for certain now it wouldn't have mattered. So long as Edward had Margaret, he would have a place to belong, a place where he felt completely, undeniably whole. Epilogue. The wedding was a grand ceremony with far more embellishment than Margaret could have ever dreamt of, much less expected. Rupert and Johanna attended, as did Nick. She'd felt bad, hiring the Royal Lion to provide the food for the event, instead of inviting her old employer and co-workers as regular guests. Rupert, eyes sparkling, had laughed her off. "Surely you aren't serious. Can you imagine the exposure we would get at such an event? Miss Andrews, you have paid us back in full a dozen times over. We are forever in your debt." Of course, Margaret wasn't Miss Andrews anymore. Now she was Margaret Lockwood, the Duchess of Somerset. When the ceremony was over and all of their guests departed, Margaret found herself dwelling less on the status elevation that came with her new title and more on the anxiety steadily building beneath her skin at the prospect of their wedding night. "What if I get it wrong?" she worried, trying to calm her breathing as she readied herself for bed. "What if we do this, and then Edward no longer feels the same way?" Perhaps she hadn't fully gotten over the aftermath of their first real kiss, that ugly early fear of Edward losing respect for her if she gave in to her passion. Yet when Margaret entered the bedroom, blushing shyly in her silken nightclothes, the way Edward looked at her erased even her most fervent doubts. "My darling," Edward said, as his hands settled around her waist, My dearest Margaret. She couldn't take it anymore. She'd resisted for so long, longer than she'd ever thought possible. Margaret pressed her body against her love's, and then suddenly he was everywhere. Feeling her, holding her. She wanted all of him, to be taken and held and cherished. To the bed? Edward whispered in her ear, breath hot against her neck. Margaret nodded frantically. To the bed. Their momentum slowed there, as shyness took over Margaret once more. Up until now she had still been in her nightclothes, but as Edward laid her back gently and began to press the skirt of her gown upward, past her knees, Margaret found herself pressing her eyes closed. "Margaret," Edward said, stilling his movements. "I'm all right," she said quickly. "Just nervous." Her voice grew small. "I want to be good enough for you. Truth be told, I'm frightened that I'm not." Edward sat back at Margaret's pronouncement. Her eyes were still closed, tightly enough she could see stars behind them. Yet she was all too aware of Edward's movements. The heat of his presence, even though he was now merely looming over her rather than touching her outright. "My dearest Margaret," Edward's voice came out in a low breath, followed by a small, almost hidden laugh. "You fear you're not good enough for me?" "Well, yes," said Margaret, opening her eyes at last. "You are a duke, Edward, and you are a duke's bride." Edward looked at her sternly. A legless duke's bride, but a duke's bride nonetheless. "And even if you weren't, Margaret, you are the most exceptional woman I have ever known. What more can I do to prove my feelings?" Edward waited for her answer, his eyes dark with lust and intensity. A distant part of Margaret's brain knew this conversation could circle around itself forever if they let it. Insecurities like theirs did not just disappear all at once. But this was a conversation for the next morning, and all the mornings after that, forever and ever. Edward would be there for each one, Margaret was certain. Right now it was their night. With her eyes now locked onto Edward's, Margaret reached down and pulled her own skirt up above her waist. Edward's breath hitched, and he moved back just slightly, surprised by her boldness. But Margaret wasn't giving up there. She latched onto the boldness, nurtured it, committed to it, in hopes she could cling to it through the treacherous shyness. "Show me," Margaret whispered, and hooked her legs around her love's. That was all the encouragement Edward needed. He bent over her, planting kisses down her neck, down her collarbone, and onto her chest. After a moment of hesitation, he mouthed at her breast through the thin satin fabric. Margaret felt her nipple harden, and she arched her back in pleasure. "More, Edward, more." She gripped his hand and moved it to the strap of her gown, urging him to remove it. Edward pulled the fabric up, wrestling the gown up from underneath her and over her head. Margaret felt her breasts spill free, and then Edward was taking her in his mouth again, no more fabric between them. When Margaret was gasping for breath, her nether regions throbbing in anticipation, Edward pulled back, his eyes hesitant, brimming with a question. She could feel his hardness pressing into her hip. "Yes," Margaret whispered, wet and desperate for it. Edward nodded, accepting her words, even as his face flushed with embarrassment. Margaret waited, allowing herself to feel every sensation, to languish in it, while Edward's hands left her long enough to fully remove his own garments. She gasped in shock and pleasure at the feel of his strong fingers, brushing at her entrance. "Are you ready?" Edward asked quietly, circling at the soft, sensitive skin with his thumb. "More than ready," Margaret breathed. A whine escaped from the back of her throat. "Edward, please." He slipped the first finger inside. Margaret couldn't help it. She tensed up. Edward stilled his hand immediately at the sound of her sharp intake of breath. "I'm all right," Margaret said quickly. She didn't want him to even think about removing himself. If anything, she wanted more, needed more, even if it took her a moment to adjust. Edward waited, while Margaret focused on releasing the tension in her thighs and hips. When she was sure she could take it, she nodded. "I'm ready." "Are you certain?" "Yes, Edward, Margaret's whole body felt hot, flush with arousal and embarrassment. "I want to feel you inside me. I want it so badly. I've wanted it for so long, please." Edward obliged. He took his time working her open, making sure she had time to adjust to 2 fingers, and then 3. He asked her permission once more, committed to making sure she was absolutely ready when the time came to take his length in full. "I don't want to hurt you," he insisted. "You could never hurt me," said Margaret, pulling her knees higher and spreading her legs even wider still. She felt exposed, open, but ready. She needed him to fill her. Edward must have finally accepted the desire and desperation Margaret was signalling. He lined himself up. Slowly he pressed inside. The breath Margaret had been holding came out in a great rush. "I want him to have everything," she thought, bearing down on him with her hips. "You are my everything," Edward said, and only then did Margaret realize the words had spilled from her lips aloud. They fell into a rhythm. Edward pressing her into the bed just enough, never so much that she was uncomfortable, but enough that she was always aware of his strength, his control. Margaret pressed herself into him, desperate for him to go deeper, to fill her up. She wanted to know what it was like to have him dripping down her thighs. Before long, the ebb and flow of her pleasure, growing and retreating, began to crest. "Edward," she gasped, clinging to his muscled back as if her life depended on it. "Edward, Pleasure washed over her, shooting out from that hot bundle of nerves deep inside her that no one but Edward could reach. Tingles shot through her limbs as sparks erupted behind her vision. Edward followed soon after, spilling inside her, making her his. She'd already been his, it was true, in feeling and name, but now there was no way anyone could deny it, certainly not themselves. "I love you," Margaret whispered much later, when the 2 of them lay awake together in the dark. She was wrapped around him, pressing her spent body tight against his chest. "And you," Edward whispered back. He pulled her body closer against his chest. "Forever." For the first time since she could remember, in every way imaginable, Margaret fell asleep completely satisfied. His Devilish Grace story is available on our website and on Amazon.
Scan the QR code or click on the link in the description to read the next book in the series. Share this video with your friend or watch on of the following videos. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell to not miss any new audiobooks. Thank you for watching.